Tonight, I've prepared a compilation of trucker stories. Be sure to like and subscribe to help support the channel. Now, let's begin the stories. Story 1. The Road That Eats Headlights from Mudflap Mike. I've been driving trucks for 37 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything the highway had to offer. I've driven through blizzards that turned the world into a white void, thunderstorms that shook my rig like a toy, and heat waves that made the asphalt shimmer like water. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened on Route 47, that autumn night when the road decided it was hungry. It started ordinary enough. I was hauling a load of machinery parts from Ohio to Nevada, running my usual route through the backroads because I've never been fond of the interstate tolls. The sun had set about an hour earlier, and the sky had that deep purple quality it gets right before true darkness settles in. I had my CB radio playing low, just the usual chatter between drivers, and I was sipping on my third cup of coffee from the thermos my wife had packed that morning. The road stretched out before me, straight as an arrow, cutting through farmland that had already been harvested for the season. Corn stubble stood in neat rows on either side, and the air coming through my cracked window smelled like earth and coming rain. My headlights were doing their job, carving out a tunnel of visibility in the gathering darkness, when I noticed something strange. The beams seemed to be getting shorter. At first, I thought maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me, or perhaps some fog was rolling in. But when I checked my mirrors, the world behind me was perfectly clear. The stars were starting to come out, bright and sharp, and I could see the silhouette of a barn about a quarter-mile back. But ahead of me, my headlights, which should have been illuminating the road for at least 100 yards, were only reaching about 50. I tapped the switch, flicking between high beams and low beams, but it made no difference. If anything, the reach of my lights seemed to be shrinking even more. Now they were only projecting about 30 yards ahead, and I could feel my heart starting to pick up its pace. I've dealt with electrical problems before, alternators going bad or wiring getting corroded, but this was different. The lights weren't dimming. They were just somehow not traveling as far as they should. It was as if something was absorbing them, drinking them up before they could reach the distance they were meant to cover. I slowed down instinctively because driving with reduced visibility is asking for trouble. And I started looking for a place to pull over and check my rig. But this stretch of Route 47 didn't offer much in the way of shoulders, just narrow strips of gravel on either side that dropped off into drainage ditches. I decided to keep going until I reached the rest stop I knew was about 10 miles ahead, but I kept my speed down to 40 miles an hour, which felt painfully slow in the darkness that seemed to be pressing in on all sides. That's when I noticed the second strange thing. The darkness ahead of me wasn't just dark, it was thick. I know that sounds crazy, but there's no other way to describe it. It looked almost solid, like a wall of black velvet hanging across the road, and my headlights were being absorbed into it like water into a sponge. I could see the light beams clearly for the first 10 yards or so, bright and strong, but then they just faded away, not gradually like they should, but abruptly, as if they were hitting something and stopping. My hands were starting to sweat on the steering wheel, and I reached for my CB radio. I needed to hear another human voice, needed to know I wasn't losing my mind out here. I keyed the mic and said, "Breaker 19, this is Mudflap Mike heading west on Route 47. Any drivers out there experiencing visibility problems?" My headlights seemed to be going wonky. Static crackled through the speaker, and then a voice came through, scratchy, but understandable. "This is Hammer Down Harry, Mike. I'm about 15 miles east of you, and I got nothing like that. Lights are working fine. You might want to pull over and check your electrical." I thanked him and hung the mic back up, but his words didn't comfort me much. If his lights were fine just 15 miles away, then whatever was happening to mine was localized, specific to this exact stretch of road I was on. The thought sent a chill down my spine despite the warmth of the cab. Now my headlights were only reaching about 15 yards, and I had slowed to a crawl, maybe 20 miles an hour. The darkness ahead looked impenetrable, and I was seriously considering just stopping right there in the middle of the road and waiting for dawn, consequences be damned. But something kept me moving forward, some stubborn part of my brain that insisted this had to be explainable, that there had to be a rational reason for what was happening. That's when I saw the eyes. They appeared in that wall of darkness ahead, floating about 4 feet off the ground, and they were the strangest color I'd ever seen, a sort of phosphorescent yellow-green that seemed to generate its own light. They didn't blink, just stared at me as I approached, and I felt every muscle in my body go tense. I hit the brakes, bringing my rig to a complete stop, and I sat there with my hands gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. The eyes didn't move. They just hung there in the darkness, watching me, and I realized with a jolt of terror that they weren't reflecting my headlights the way animal eyes do. They were glowing on their own, producing their own eerie illumination that did nothing to light up the surrounding darkness. I've seen plenty of animals on the road over the years, deer and raccoons, and even a bear once, and their eyes always reflect light in a way that's distinctive. These eyes weren't reflecting anything. They were generating light, pulsing slightly, like a heartbeat. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at those eyes, and having them stare right back at me. It might have been 30 seconds, or it might have been 5 minutes. Time seemed to have lost all meaning. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I was breathing in short, shallow gasps. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to throw the truck in reverse and get the hell out of there, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, caught in that terrible gaze, and I could feel something probing at the edges of my mind, something vast and hungry and utterly alien. Then, slowly, the eyes began to move. They rose upward, climbing higher and higher until they were at least 10 feet off the ground. And I realized with a fresh wave of horror that whatever this thing was, it was massive. The eyes separated, moving apart from each other, and I understood that it was spreading itself across the road, blocking the entire width of it. My headlights, which had shrunk to pitiful beams that barely extended past my front bumper, were being swallowed whole by this thing, this creature or entity or whatever it was that had decided to make Route 47 its hunting ground. I found my voice then, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "What are you?" I asked, knowing I wouldn't get an answer, but needing to say something, anything, to break the terrible silence. The eyes pulsed brighter in response, and I felt that presence in my mind grow stronger, pushing against my thoughts, trying to get in. Images flashed through my head, pictures that weren't mine, visions of other drivers on other nights, their headlights shrinking and dying as this thing fed on the light, leaving them blind and helpless in the darkness. That broke the spell. Terror gave way to pure survival instinct, and I slammed my hand down on the gear shift, throwing the truck into reverse. The transmission screamed in protest, but the truck started moving backward, slowly at first, and then picking up speed. I kept my foot on the accelerator, watching in my mirrors as I reversed down the highway, and I saw those eyes begin to follow, floating forward through the darkness, matching my speed. My headlights suddenly snapped back to full power. The beams shot forward, bright and strong, illuminating a good 100 yards of road ahead, and in that light, I saw it. The thing was like a stain on reality itself, a patch of darkness so complete that it seemed to absorb not just light, but the very concept of light. It had no real form that I could make out, just a vague sense of immensity and wrongness, and those terrible eyes that burned with their own cold fire. The light from my headlights hit it, and simply vanished, sucked in and consumed, and I watched in horror as my beams began to shrink again. I kept reversing, my neck craning to see behind me, praying that no other vehicles would come up behind me on this lonely stretch of road. The thing kept pace with me for what felt like an eternity, those eyes never leaving me, and I could feel its hunger like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. But gradually, slowly, the eyes began to dim. They pulsed more weakly, and the presence in my mind started to withdraw, and I realized with a flood of relief that I was getting out of its range, moving beyond whatever territory it had claimed. After about a mile of reversing, the eyes disappeared entirely, winking out like someone had flipped a switch. My headlights immediately returned to full strength, blazing out into the night. And I sat there gasping for breath, my whole body shaking with adrenaline. I put the truck in drive and turned around at the first opportunity, heading back the way I'd come. I drove 20 miles east before I felt safe enough to pull into a truck stop, and I sat in the parking lot until dawn, drinking cold coffee and trying to make sense of what had happened. I reported it, of course. Called the highway patrol and told them there was something wrong with Route 47, that it was dangerous and needed to be checked out. They were polite, but clearly thought I was either drunk or crazy, and they assured me they'd send someone to investigate. I don't know if they ever did. I never drove that stretch of road again, and I never will. I take the long way around now, even though it adds 2 hours to my trip. Some roads aren't meant to be traveled at night, and some things that live in the darkness are better left alone. But here's the thing that keeps me up sometimes, the thought that won't let me rest easy. I've talked to other drivers over the years, swapped stories over coffee at truck stops, and I've heard whispers. Whispers about other roads where headlights don't work quite right, where the darkness seems a little too thick, and where drivers have seen eyes watching them from the void. It makes me wonder how many of these things are out there, scattered across the country's back roads, waiting in the dark for the next truck to come along. It makes me wonder what they are, these things that feed on light, and where they came from. But most of all, it makes me wonder what happens to the drivers who don't have the sense to back up, who keep going forward into that hungry darkness until their lights are completely consumed and they're left alone with those terrible, glowing eyes. Story 2. The fog that smells like rotten fruit from Rusty Joe. The thing about fog is that it's supposed to be clean. It's just water vapor, condensed air. The clouds come down to earth level to say hello before moving on. I've driven through fog banks that stretched for miles, that reduced visibility to almost nothing, that turned the highway into a guessing game where you followed the white lines and prayed nobody had stopped in front of you. But fog is supposed to smell like moisture, like damp earth or the rain that's coming or the river that's nearby. Fog isn't supposed to smell like death and decay and fruit that's gone so rotten it's turned to liquid in the bottom of the barrel. I learned that the hard way on a September night in Northern California, on a stretch of Highway 101 that cuts through the redwood forests. I was making good time, hauling a load of wine from Napa Valley up to a distributor in Oregon, and I was in that pleasant state of mind that comes from a smooth drive and a pocket full of per diem money. The radio was playing classic rock at a low volume, and I was humming along, watching the trees slip past in the darkness, their massive trunks briefly illuminated by my headlights before disappearing back into the night. The fog came on suddenly, the way it often does in those forests. One moment I was driving under clear skies with stars visible through breaks in the canopy, and the next moment I was engulfed in a white mist that seemed to materialize out of nowhere. I slowed down immediately, dropping from 60 to 40, and I flicked on my fog lights, which helped a little, but not much. The mist was thick, the kind that seems to have weight and substance, and it swirled in my headlight beams like something alive. That's when I noticed the smell. It hit me even though my windows were rolled up, seeping into the cab through the vents and the tiny gaps around the doors. It was sweet at first, almost cloying, like fruit that's just past its prime. But underneath that sweetness was something else, something that made my stomach turn over. It smelled like rot and fermentation and sickness, like walking into a kitchen where someone had forgotten about the fruit bowl for 3 months in the summer heat. I reached over and switched off the air circulation, putting it on recirculate so I wouldn't be pulling in outside air, but it didn't help much. The smell was already in the cab, and it seemed to be getting stronger with every passing second. I cracked my window, thinking maybe fresh air would help, but that just made it worse. The stench rolled in like a wave, so powerful it made my eyes water, and I quickly rolled the window back up. Story 3. The truck that hums a tune I never knew from Ghost Gear Gary. Every truck has its own song. That's something you learn after a few years on the road. The way the engine rumbles, the squeak of a particular spring in the seat, the rattle of something loose in the toolbox. the whistle of air through a gap in the door seal. Put it all together, and you've got a symphony that's unique to that one rig. And after a while, you stop hearing it as noise and start hearing it as music. It becomes the soundtrack to your life, the background hum that tells you everything's working the way it should. I've driven 7 different trucks in my 23 years of hauling freight, and I knew each of their songs by heart. But the truck I'm going to tell you about, the one I drove for 3 months before I couldn't take it anymore, that truck sang something I'd never heard before and never want to hear again. It hummed a tune that wasn't mechanical, wasn't the result of diesel engines and worn bearings and air pressure systems. It hummed a tune that sounded almost human, almost like a voice, and the melody it sang was one I'd never learned, but somehow recognized in the deepest part of my soul. I picked up the rig at an auction in Tennessee. It was a beautiful truck, I'll give it that. A Peterbilt 379, with a long nose and enough chrome to blind you in direct sunlight. The previous owner had taken good care of the exterior. The paint was immaculate, a deep midnight blue that seemed to shift colors in different light, and all the bright work gleamed like new. The inside was clean too, cleaner than most used trucks I'd seen, with leather seats that showed minimal wear, and a dashboard that looked like it had been wiped down daily. The auction manager told me the truck had belonged to a driver named Thomas Carlyle, who'd apparently walked away from trucking one day without explanation, just parked the rig at a truck stop, left the keys in the ignition, and disappeared. No note, no phone call to his company, nothing. They'd tried to track him down for months, but he'd vanished completely, and eventually, the company had given up and sent the truck to auction to recoup their losses. I should have asked more questions. I should have wondered why a driver would abandon such a nice rig, why the company was selling it instead of reassigning it to another driver, why the starting bid was so low for a truck in such good condition. But I was looking to buy my own rig and go independent, and the price was right, and I let greed and ambition override common sense. I made my bid, won the auction, and drove away thinking I'd gotten the deal of a lifetime. Story 4. The Woman with a Mirror for a Face from Diesel Dan. I picked her up outside of Amarillo at 2 in the morning, and I knew right away I was making a mistake. But she was standing there in the rain, soaked to the bone, with her thumb out and a desperate look on her face, or at least what I could see of her face in the glow of my headlights, and I've never been good at leaving people stranded. My mama raised me to help folks in need, and even after 40 years of driving trucks and seeing the dark side of human nature, I still can't shake that basic decency that was drilled into me as a kid. I pulled over onto the shoulder, gravel crunching under my tires, and I leaned across to roll down the passenger window. The rain was coming down hard, drumming on the roof of my cab, and the wind was gusting strong enough to rock the truck slightly on its suspension. She hurried over, moving quickly despite the weather, and when she reached the door, I got my first good look at her. She was wearing a long coat that might have been nice once, but was now tattered and stained, and her hair hung in wet ropes around her shoulders, so dark it looked black in the sodium yellow glow of the parking lot lights we'd just passed. But it was her face that made me hesitate, my hand frozen on the door lock. At first, I thought she was wearing a mask, something reflective and strange. But as she tilted her head to look up at me, I realized with a cold shock that what I was seeing was real. Her face was a mirror, not like mirror-smooth skin or eyes that reflected light in an unusual way, but an actual mirror, flat and perfect, showing me my own startled expression, staring back at me from where her features should have been. Story 5. The CB channel that laughs from Outlaw Owen. The CB radio has been a trucker's lifeline for as long as I can remember. It's how we warn each other about speed traps and accidents, how we fight the loneliness of the long haul, how we stay connected to a community of people who understand what this life is really like. I've heard every kind of conversation on the CB over the years. I've heard drivers sharing recipes and marriage advice, arguing about politics and sports, telling jokes that range from hilarious to terrible, and occasionally having breakdowns where they pour their hearts out to strangers who somehow become friends through nothing but a shared radio frequency. but I'd never heard laughter like what came through on Channel 19 that night in Montana. It wasn't the good-natured chuckling of drivers sharing a joke, or the nervous laughter of someone trying to cope with a close call on the road. This was something else entirely. Something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, and my hands tightened on the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. It was laughter that sounded wrong, that had notes in it that human vocal cords shouldn't be able to produce, and it went on and on without pause for breath, without variation in tone, without ever seeming to end. I was running a load of electronics from Seattle to Minneapolis, taking the northern route because it was winter, and I preferred the cold to the ice storms that were hammering the more southern highways. It was around 11 at night, and I was crossing the big empty stretch of Montana, where you can drive for an hour without seeing another vehicle, where the darkness is so complete it feels like you're driving through outer space rather than across the earth. The sky was clear, and the stars were out in force, billions of them scattered across the black vault above me, and I had my CB turned up loud for company, listening to the occasional chatter from other drivers scattered across the frequencies range. The laughter started as a faint sound in the background, almost buried under the static. At first I thought it was just interference, maybe some atmospheric condition, causing strange echoes or picking up a television signal from somewhere. But as I adjusted the squelch and fine-tuned the channel, the laughter became clearer, and I realized it was coming through on Channel 19 itself. The main trucking channel, the one that should have been filled with drivers checking their positions and warning each other about road conditions. It was a woman's laughter, high and bright and continuous, and there was something gleeful about it that made my skin crawl. It didn't sound like someone who'd heard a funny joke or was enjoying a happy moment. It sounded like someone who'd lost their mind, who'd crossed some line between sanity and madness and found something hilarious on the other side. The laughter had a hysterical edge to it, a quality that suggested whoever was making that sound had forgotten how to stop, or had never known in the first place. I keyed my mic and said, "Breaker 19, this is Outlaw Owen. Who's that laughing on the channel? You're blocking up the frequency." I tried to keep my voice calm and professional, even though my heart was starting to beat faster in my chest. The laughter continued without pause, without any acknowledgement that I'd spoken. It just kept going, that high, bright, terrible sound pouring through my speakers like water through a broken dam. Other drivers started chiming in, their voices crackling through the static. "Yeah, what's going on? Someone's got their mic stuck. Can, whoever that is, please release their talk button? This is getting real old, real fast, folks." But the laughter didn't stop. It didn't even waver. It just continued at the same pitch and intensity, never pausing for breath, never changing in tone or volume. I switched to Channel 9 to see if other drivers were experiencing the same thing, and immediately several voices confirmed that they were. A driver who identified himself as Mountain Mike said he'd been hearing it for the last 10 minutes, and it was starting to freak him out. A woman calling herself Nighthawk Nancy said she'd tried switching channels but the laughter followed her, appearing on whatever frequency she selected. That sent a fresh chill down my spine because CB radios don't work that way. A signal can't follow you from channel to channel. Each frequency is separate, distinct, and you shouldn't be able to hear the same transmission across multiple channels simultaneously. I switched back to Channel 19, and the laughter was still there, unchanged, unending. I turned down the volume, but even at the lowest setting where I could barely hear anything else, that laughter came through clear and strong. I tried switching to other channels, running through the entire range of 40 frequencies, and on every single one, underneath whatever other traffic there was, I could hear that woman laughing. Sometimes it was faint, barely audible, and sometimes it was loud enough to drown out everything else, but it was always there, always the same, never stopping. My hands were shaking now, and I realized I was sweating despite the cold winter air outside. There was something deeply wrong about this, something that violated the natural order of things. CB radios are simple technology, basic radio transmitters and receivers that operate on specific frequencies. They don't do what this was doing. They can't do what this was doing. But here it was happening anyway, and I could feel my rational mind trying to find explanations, while some deeper, more primitive part of my brain was screaming at me to throw the radio out the window and drive as fast as I could in the opposite direction. Then the laughter changed. It dropped in pitch suddenly, becoming deeper, more masculine, though it maintained that same hysterical quality. And then it split, becoming two voices laughing in harmony, one high and one low, both maintaining that endless stream of mirth that had no humor in it. Then 3 voices, then 4, then so many, I couldn't count them all. A chorus of laughter that filled my cab and seemed to vibrate through the very frame of my truck. I reached for the power switch to turn off the radio entirely, and my hand froze halfway there, because now, mixed in with the laughter, I could hear words. They were distorted and hard to make out, woven into the spaces between the laughing sounds, but they were definitely words. I leaned closer to the speaker, straining to understand, and gradually, the message became clear. "We see you driving," the voices said, still laughing, the words bubbling up through the laughter like air through water. "We see you all of you drivers out there in the dark, thinking you're alone, thinking you're safe in your steel boxes rolling across the earth. But you're not alone. You're never alone. We're always here, always watching, always listening to your conversations on these frequencies. We hear everything you say, every secret you share, every fear you confess to strangers in the night." My blood had gone cold, and I could feel sweat running down my back, despite the heater blasting warm air into the cab. This wasn't a prank, wasn't some bored kids playing with the radio. This was something else, something that knew exactly what it was doing, something that was deliberately trying to terrify every driver listening. "We ride with you," the voices continued, the laughter never stopping, just providing a constant backdrop to the words. "In the blind spots, your mirrors don't cover. In the shadows, your headlights don't reach. In the moments when you glance away from the road and see something move in your peripheral vision. We're there. We've always been there. And tonight we decided to say hello, to let you know we're here, to remind you that the darkness you drive through is deeper than you think, and full of things you can't imagine." Drivers were panicking now on the other channels, their voices tight with fear. Someone was praying in Spanish, the words tumbling out in a desperate stream. Someone else was cursing, demanding to know what kind of sick joke this was. A woman was crying, saying she couldn't take it anymore, that she was pulling over and calling the police. But underneath all of it, constant and unending, was that laughter, that terrible chorus of voices finding infinite amusement in our fear. And then, abruptly, it stopped. The laughter cut off mid-sound, as if someone had flipped a switch, and the CB fell silent. Not just quiet, but completely silent, without even the normal static hiss that's always present. For several long seconds, there was nothing but that eerie, complete silence, and then gradually the static returned, and drivers started keying their mics, asking if anyone else was still there, if anyone else had heard what they'd heard. I didn't participate in those conversations. I turned off my CB radio and drove the rest of that night in silence, watching the road ahead and trying not to look at my mirrors too often, trying not to think about blind spots and shadows and things that might be riding along with me in places I couldn't see. I drove straight through to Minneapolis without stopping, even though I was exhausted and my eyes were burning and I knew I was violating every safe driving regulation in the book. When I finally pulled into the truck stop near my destination, the sun was coming up, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, and I felt like I could breathe again. I talked to other drivers over coffee, and every one of them had heard the laughter. It had covered every channel across a range of at least 500 miles, affecting every CB radio within that area simultaneously. There was no explanation for it, no source that could be identified, no rational reason for how it had happened. The official story, when someone finally bothered to investigate, was that it had been some kind of atmospheric anomaly, a rare condition that had caused a single powerful signal to propagate across multiple frequencies. They suggested it had been a pirate radio broadcast, Someone with illegal equipment playing a recording to mess with truckers. But that explanation didn't account for how the signal had followed drivers from channel to channel, or how it had seemed to know exactly what to say to maximize our fear, or why it had stopped so suddenly and completely. I still use my CB radio because I have to, because it's part of the job and how we communicate out here on the road. But I keep the volume lower now, and sometimes late at night, when I'm driving through empty stretches of highway, I'll hear something in the static that sounds almost like laughter. It's faint, and I can never be quite sure if it's real, or just my imagination playing tricks on me. But every time I hear it, my hands tighten on the wheel, and I find myself checking my mirrors more frequently, looking for things that might be hiding in the blind spots, riding along with me through the darkness. Story 6. The highway patrol car that melts from Iron Ike. I've been pulled over plenty of times in my trucking career. Sometimes it was deserved. Times when I was pushing the speed limit, or my logbook wasn't quite up to date, or I'd forgotten to check one of my lights before heading out. Other times it felt like harassment, like the officer was just having a bad day and decided to take it out on whoever happened to be driving past. But whether the stop was fair or not, it always followed a predictable pattern. The lights would flash in my mirror. I'd pull over to the shoulder, the officer would approach my window, and we'd have a conversation that ended either with a warning or a ticket. What happened on Interstate 40 outside of Flagstaff didn't follow that pattern at all. What happened was impossible, and yet I watched it unfold with my own eyes, and to this day I can't explain it in any way that makes sense. I've tried to convince myself it was a hallucination, that maybe I'd been driving too long and my brain had misfired and created a waking dream. But the physical evidence says otherwise. The dashcam footage, which I've watched dozens of times now, shows exactly what I remember seeing. It happened, it was real, and I still don't understand what it means. It was mid-afternoon on a Tuesday in June, and I was hauling furniture from California to New Mexico. The weather was perfect, hot and dry, with the sky so blue it hurt to look at, and traffic was light enough that I was making excellent time. I was in that comfortable zone where the miles just roll by, where you're alert but relaxed, where the driving becomes almost meditative. My radio was playing country music, and I was humming along, thinking about the good meal I'd have when I stopped for the night in Albuquerque. The patrol car appeared in my mirror without warning. One moment the road behind me was empty, and the next moment there were lights flashing. The distinctive red and blue of law enforcement. I checked my speedometer out of reflex, saw that I was doing exactly 65 in a 65 zone, and frowned. I hadn't been weaving, my load was secure and properly marked, and all my lights were functioning. I couldn't think of any reason for the stop, but I slowed down and started looking for a good place to pull over. The shoulder was wide enough to accommodate my rig safely, so I eased over and came to a stop, putting my truck in neutral and setting the parking brake. I rolled down my window and got my license and registration ready, following the routine I'd done 100 times before. In my side mirror, I could see the patrol car pull up behind me, and I watched as the driver's door opened. That's when things started to get strange. The officer who stepped out of the car moved oddly, sort of jerky and uncoordinated, like a puppet being controlled by someone who wasn't quite sure how puppets worked. He was wearing a standard highway patrol uniform, complete with the wide-brimmed hat and mirrored sunglasses, but something about his proportions seemed off. His arms were too long, reaching almost to his knees, and his legs seemed to bend in places where there shouldn't be joints. I told myself I was seeing things, that the heat shimmer from the desert was distorting my view, but as he walked toward my truck, the wrongness only became more apparent. He wasn't walking so much as flowing, his body moving in ways that didn't match the motion of his legs, and I realized with a sick feeling in my stomach that his uniform wasn't sitting right on his body. It looked like it was draped over something that wasn't quite human-shaped, like a child wearing their parents' clothes. He reached my window and tilted his head up to look at me, and I couldn't see his eyes behind those mirrored sunglasses, just my own frightened reflection staring back at me. "License and registration," he said, and his voice was wrong too. It had the right words and the right tone, that flat, authoritative sound that cops use. But underneath it, there was something else, a sort of buzzing quality, like static on a radio. My hands were shaking as I handed over my documents, and he took them with fingers that had too many knuckles. He looked down at my license, or at least I assumed he was looking at it because his head was pointed in the right direction. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was actually looking at something else entirely. At some aspect of me that had nothing to do with my physical appearance or legal identity. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" he asked, still in that buzzing voice, and I shook my head, not trusting myself to speak. My throat had gone dry, and my heart was hammering in my chest so hard, I thought he must be able to hear it. "You've been driving through our territory," he said, and that was definitely not something a normal police officer would say. "You've been passing through for years, you and all the others like you, never seeing us, never knowing we're here. But we see you, we watch you, and sometimes, when we get curious, we decide to say hello." I wanted to run, wanted to throw my truck in gear and floor it and leave this impossible officer behind, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, caught in whatever this was. And all I could do was watch and listen as this thing wearing a police uniform told me secrets I'd never wanted to know. "There are thin places in the world," he continued. And now his voice was changing, becoming less human with every word, the buzzing quality getting stronger. "Places where what you call reality wears thin, where other things can push through, where we can take forms you'll recognize and interact with you in ways you'll almost understand. This highway is one of those places. The long straight stretches of asphalt cutting through the desert, all that human certainty imposed on the wilderness. It creates cracks, openings, opportunities." And then he started to melt. There's no other word for it. His face began to run like wax in the sun, the features blurring and sliding downward, the mirrored sunglasses sinking into what had been his cheeks, the hat tilting and then falling through what had been his head. His uniform followed, the fabric losing its structure and dripping down toward the ground, and beneath it, I could see something that made my mind rebel, something that was definitely not human, definitely not anything I had words to describe. It was like looking at a piece of the desert that had learned to move, a mass of sand and heat, shimmer and shadow that had pulled itself together into a vaguely human shape and was now falling apart, losing cohesion, returning to its natural state. I could see things moving within it, shapes that might have been organs, or might have been something else entirely. And the buzzing sound was getting louder, filling my ears, vibrating through the frame of my truck. "Don't forget us," the thing said, though it no longer had anything resembling a mouth. The words came from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating directly into my skull. "Don't forget that you're never alone on these roads. That there are things older than your civilization watching from the spaces between, waiting for chances to reach across and touch your world. We're not hostile, not exactly, but we're not friendly either. We're just curious. We just want to understand. We just want to see what you're made of." The patrol car behind my truck was melting too. I could see it in my mirror, the metal and plastic and glass running together like colored oils mixing, flowing down into a puddle that spread across the asphalt. The lights were still flashing somehow, still pulsing red and blue, but now they were just colors in the puddle, not attached to any physical source, and the sight of it made my head hurt. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it was over. The thing that had pretended to be a police officer collapsed completely, spreading out across the ground like spilled paint, and then it simply soaked into the asphalt and disappeared. The patrol car finished melting, the last solid pieces flowing away, and within seconds, there was nothing left but a faint stain on the road that could have been oil or water or anything else. I sat there for a long time, probably 10 minutes, just breathing and trying to process what I'd seen. My license and registration were lying on the ground where the officer had dropped them when he started to melt, and eventually I opened my door and climbed down to retrieve them. They were hot to the touch, almost burning, and there was a smell in the air like ozone and burnt plastic. I checked my dash cam when I got back in the truck. rewound the footage, and watched it play out exactly as I remembered. The patrol car appearing, the officer approaching, the melting, all of it captured in perfect digital clarity. I saved that footage to 3 separate drives, and uploaded it to a cloud server, because I knew that, without proof, nobody would ever believe me. Story 7. The rest stop where my heartbeat echoes from Freightliner Frank. Rest stops are supposed to be safe havens. They're those little islands of civilization scattered along the highways. Places where you can pull off the road and take a break. Use the facilities, stretch your legs, maybe catch a quick nap before pushing on. I've stopped at hundreds of them over the years, from the big modern plazas with restaurants and gift shops, to the tiny turnouts with nothing but a bathroom and a picnic table. They're all fundamentally the same in their purpose. They give drivers a place to pause, to remember they're human beings and not just machines moving cargo from point A to point B. But the rest stop I'm going to tell you about wasn't a safe haven. It was something else entirely, something wrong and strange and impossible. And every time I think about it, I get a sick feeling in my stomach and a tightness in my chest that makes me wonder if maybe my heart never really left that place. If some part of me is still there in that strange space where physics didn't work right and my own body became alien to me. It was somewhere in West Virginia, on one of those winding highways that snake through the Appalachian Mountains. I'd been driving for 7 hours straight, hauling a load of machine parts from Detroit to Charlotte, and I needed a break badly. My back was aching from sitting in the same position, my bladder was full, and my eyes were starting to burn from staring at the road. When I saw the sign for a rest stop in 2 miles, I nearly cried with relief. The rest stop sat in a hollow between 2 mountains, surrounded by thick forest that pressed in close on all sides. It was bigger than I'd expected, with parking for maybe 30 trucks and a substantial brick building that housed the bathrooms and a visitor information center. But it was completely empty. Not a single vehicle in the lot, no lights on in the building, nothing. That should have warned me off right there, because even at odd hours, there's usually at least one other truck in a rest stop, at least one other driver taking advantage of a safe place to pause. But I was tired and uncomfortable, and I needed that bathroom, so I ignored my instincts and pulled in. The silence was the first thing I noticed when I turned off my engine. Complete and total silence. The kind that makes your ears ring because they're straining to hear something, anything, to fill the void. No wind through the trees, no bird song, no distant traffic noise from the highway, nothing, just silence so profound it felt like a physical presence, like a weight pressing down on me from all sides. I climbed out of my truck, my boots crunching on the gravel, and that sound seemed obscenely loud in the quiet. I started walking toward the bathroom building, and that's when I first noticed it. My footsteps were echoing, but not the way they should. Normally, when you hear an echo, it's slightly delayed. A repetition of the original sound that comes a fraction of a second later. But these echoes were synchronized perfectly with my steps, happening at exactly the same moment, as if someone was walking right beside me, matching my pace precisely. I stopped walking, and the echoes stopped too, instantly, with no delay. I took a single step, and the echo happened simultaneously. I started walking again, faster this time, almost jogging, and the echoes matched me perfectly, multiple footsteps, in perfect harmony with my own. It made my skin crawl, made me feel like I wasn't alone, even though I could clearly see the parking lot was empty. Then I heard my heartbeat, not felt it, which would have been normal, but heard it, loud and clear, echoing through the air, like the footsteps had been. It was coming from all around me, from the building and the trees and the ground itself. My own heart rhythm being broadcast somehow, amplified and reflected back at me. Thaw-thump, 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 steady and strong and unmistakably mine, because I could feel the beat in my chest and hear it in the air at exactly the same moment. I should have left right then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get back in my truck and drive away, to put as much distance between myself and this wrong place as possible. But I was frozen, trapped by the impossibility of what I was experiencing, by the need to understand what was happening. I took a step toward the building, and my heartbeat got louder. I took another step, and it got louder still. And now, I could hear other things too. The rush of blood through my veins, the creaking of my joints, the soft whistle of air moving in and out of my lungs. By the time I reached the bathroom building, I could hear everything my body was doing. Every nerve firing, every muscle contracting, every organ performing its function. It was like someone had put microphones inside me and hooked them up to the world's most powerful amplifier, broadcasting every tiny biological process that normally happens in silence. I could hear my stomach digesting the sandwich I'd eaten an hour ago. I could hear the electrical impulses traveling through my nervous system. I could hear my cells metabolizing, my bones supporting my weight, my immune system fighting off microscopic invaders. It was overwhelming. Too much information, too much noise. All of it coming from inside me but being played back externally. I stumbled against the wall of the building and pressed my hands over my ears. But that didn't help, because the sounds weren't entering through my ears. They were everywhere, inside and outside simultaneously, and there was no way to block them out. I slid down the wall and sat on the concrete, trying to control my breathing, trying to calm down. But that just made things worse, because now I could hear my heart rate increasing, could hear the adrenaline dumping into my bloodstream, could hear my body's fight or flight response kicking into high gear. Every biological reaction to fear produced its own sound, and all those sounds echoed off the building and the trees and the mountains, creating a cacophony of biological noise that filled the hollow and made me feel like I was dissolving, like the boundaries between my body and the world were breaking down. I don't know how long I sat there. It might have been 5 minutes, or it might have been an hour. Time seemed to have lost all meaning, stretched out and distorted by the constant barrage of internal sounds made external. But eventually, gradually, I became aware of something else, a pattern in the noise. All these biological sounds, all these processes happening inside me, they were synchronized. They were working together in ways I'd never consciously realized, creating rhythms and harmonies, building into something that was almost musical. My heartbeat was the bass drum, steady and strong. My breathing was the melody, rising and falling. My blood flow was the strings section, rushing and ebbing. My nervous system was percussion, thousands of tiny clicks and pops creating complex patterns. And underlying all of it was something deeper, something fundamental, the basic hum of life itself, the quantum vibration of molecules and atoms, all moving in concert to create the temporary pattern called consciousness. I stopped fighting it. I stopped trying to block out the sounds, or make sense of them, or control them. I just sat there and listened to myself, really listened, for the first time in my life. And I heard the miracle of existence, the impossible complexity of biological life, the symphony that plays constantly inside every living thing but usually goes unheard beneath the noise of the external world. And then I heard someone else. Another heartbeat, different from mine, slightly slower, slightly stronger. Another set of breathing, deeper and more measured. Another body's worth of sounds, joining with mine, harmonizing. I opened my eyes and looked around, expecting to see another person, but the parking lot was still empty. Yet the sounds were there, undeniable, as clear as my own had been. Then another presence joined, and another, until I was hearing dozens of biological symphonies overlapping and interweaving, all of them echoing through this strange space. And I realized, with a certainty that went beyond rational thought, that I was hearing everyone who'd ever stopped at this rest area. Some temporal or spatial anomaly had captured them, recorded their biological signatures, and now played them back endlessly, all of them existing simultaneously in this pocket of warped reality. I heard the heartbeat of a truck driver who'd stopped here 20 years ago. I heard the breathing of a family on vacation. I heard the metabolism of teenagers on a road trip, of elderly couples taking their time, of solo travelers passing through. I heard life in all its variations, all of it preserved here, all of it echoing eternally in this hollow between mountains where the normal rules didn't apply. Eventually, my own panic subsided, replaced by a strange sense of peace. There was something beautiful about it, in a weird way. This accidental monument to all the people who'd paused here, who'd taken a moment out of their journeys to rest. We were all connected by this place, all part of the same ongoing symphony, all contributing our small piece to something larger than ourselves. When I finally stood up and walked back to my truck, I was calm. My biological sounds had faded to normal levels, no longer amplified and echoed, but I could still hear them if I focused, still sense the symphony playing beneath my skin. I drove away from that rest stop as the sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of orange and gold, and I felt changed by the experience. More aware of my own body, more conscious of the constant work happening inside me to keep me alive. I never told anyone about it, because how do you explain an experience like that? How do you make someone understand what it's like to hear your own heartbeat echo off mountains, to perceive your body as a collection of sounds rather than a solid form? But sometimes, late at night, when I'm driving through quiet stretches of highway, I'll focus on my internal rhythms, on the symphony that's always playing, and I'll remember that rest stop and feel connected to something vast and strange and wonderful, something that transcends the ordinary boundaries of time and space and self. Story 8. The radio that predicts accidents from Silent Sam. I picked up the radio at a truck stop in Nebraska, from a guy selling random electronics out of the back of a van. He had the usual stuff: CB radios, radar detectors, dash cams, all of it used but supposedly in working condition. The radio that caught my eye was a vintage unit, probably from the 70s based on the design, with analog dials and a faceplate that had yellowed with age. It was sitting off to the side, slightly apart from the other merchandise, and when I asked about it, the seller got this weird look on his face. "That one's special," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Works better than it should, if you know what I mean. $20 and it's yours." That should have been a red flag right there, because vintage electronics, in good condition, usually go for a lot more than $20, and because his eagerness to get rid of it was obvious. But I was drawn to it somehow, felt a pull toward that old radio that I couldn't quite explain, and I handed over the money before my rational mind could talk me out of it. I installed it that same day, running the power lines and hooking up the antenna, and when I turned it on for the first time, it came to life with a warm crackle that spoke of old tube technology and analog circuitry. The sound quality was surprisingly good, clear, and rich, with none of the thin harshness you get from modern digital radios. I tuned it to a local station playing classic rock, and for the next few hours, as I drove across the plains, everything was normal. The radio worked perfectly, pulling in stations with no problem, and I congratulated myself on getting such a good deal. The predictions started that evening, as the sun was setting, and I was approaching the Wyoming border. I was listening to a news station, half paying attention to a story about agricultural policy, when the broadcast suddenly cut out. For a moment there was silence, and then a voice I'd never heard before came through the speakers. It was a woman's voice, calm and measured, with the professional quality of a trained broadcaster. But there was something off about it, something slightly mechanical, as if it was being generated by a computer rather than spoken by a human. "Attention drivers on Interstate 80, the voice said. "There will be an accident at mile marker 237 in approximately 14 minutes. A blue sedan will lose control due to a tire blowout and will cross into oncoming traffic. 3 vehicles will be involved. Please exercise caution in this area." Then the voice cut out, and the regular news broadcast resumed, picking up exactly where it had left off, mid-sentence, as if there'd been no interruption at all. I stared at the radio, my hands tightening on the wheel, trying to process what I'd just heard. It had to be some kind of emergency broadcast, maybe a new system for warning drivers about road hazards. But the specificity of it was strange, and the 14-minute time frame was oddly precise. I checked my GPS. Mile marker 237 was about 20 minutes ahead at my current speed. I could slow down and arrive after the predicted accident time, or I could speed up and try to get through before it happened. Or, the rationale part of my brain suggested. I could ignore what was probably just some weird glitch or prank broadcast, and continue driving normally. I decided to speed up. Partly because I was curious, partly because I wanted to prove to myself that the broadcast had been nonsense, and partly because some instinct deep in my gut was telling me to take it seriously. I pushed my rig up to 75, watching the mile markers tick by, and when I hit mile marker 237, I slowed back down and started watching the traffic around me carefully. Exactly 14 minutes after the broadcast, almost to the second, I saw it happen. A blue Honda Accord in the right lane suddenly swerved as its front left tire exploded. The driver overcorrected, yanking the wheel too hard to the right and then too hard to the left, sending the car fishtailing across lanes. A pickup truck swerved to avoid it and clipped a minivan, which spun out and came to rest on the shoulder. The Honda ended up in the median, its front end crumpled against a concrete barrier. I hit my brakes and managed to stop in time to avoid becoming part of the pileup, and I sat there with my heart pounding as emergency vehicles arrived and other drivers got out to help. 3 vehicles, just like the broadcast had said. A blue sedan, just like it had predicted. And it had happened at exactly the time and place specified, down to the minute. I sat in my truck long after traffic started moving again, staring at that vintage radio and trying to understand what had just happened. There was no logical explanation. You can't predict accidents with that kind of precision. Traffic patterns are too chaotic, human behavior too unpredictable. Yet the radio had done exactly that. Story 9. The tunnel that opens into another night from Big Rig Bill. There are tunnels all over this country, cutting through mountains and running under rivers, making the impossible routes possible. I've driven through hundreds of them, from short passages that take 30 seconds to traverse to long tubes that swallow you up for miles at a time. They're usually unremarkable, just concrete and tile and fluorescent lights, a brief interruption in the landscape before you emerge back into open air. But the tunnel I drove through in Colorado, the one that opened into a night that wasn't the night I'd entered, that tunnel was different in ways I'm still trying to understand. I was hauling computer equipment from Denver to Salt Lake City, running a route I'd driven dozens of times before. It was early evening, maybe 7 o'clock, and the sun had just set behind the mountains, leaving that deep blue twilight that comes before full darkness. The tunnel I'm talking about is called the Eisenhower Tunnel, and it's one of the longest mountain tunnels in North America, boring through the Continental Divide at an elevation of over 11,000 feet. It's always cold inside, always dripping with condensation, and always busy with traffic moving in both directions. I entered the westbound bore as the last light was fading from the sky. The transition from the outside world to the tunnel interior was abrupt, as it always is, going from open space to enclosed concrete in an instant. My headlights came on automatically, and I settled in for the 1.5-mile journey through the mountain, watching the white tile walls slide past and listening to the echo of my engine bouncing back at me from the confined space. The tunnel seemed longer than usual. I noticed it after about a minute. That feeling you get when time is stretching out, when what should be a brief experience starts to feel extended. I checked my speedometer and saw I was doing the speed limit, 50 miles an hour, which meant I should have been through the tunnel in about 2 minutes. But I'd already been inside for what felt like 3 or 4 minutes, and I could see no sign of the exit ahead, just more tunnel stretching endlessly into the distance. I told myself I was imagining it, that my sense of time was off, that the monotony of the tunnel walls was playing tricks on my perception. But then I noticed something else. The other vehicles I'd entered the tunnel with, the cars and trucks that had been ahead of me and behind me, they were gone. The tunnel was empty except for me, my headlights the only illumination in that long concrete tube, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my own engine. The tunnel lights started to change. They'd been the normal fluorescent white, harsh and clinical, but now they were shifting toward yellow, then orange, then a deep amber that made the walls look like they were glowing from within. The temperature was changing too. It should have been cold, maybe 40 degrees, but I could feel warmth seeping into the cab, and I had to turn down my heater, even though I'd had it cranked up just moments before. I kept driving because there was nothing else to do. You can't turn around in a tunnel, can't back up, can't do anything but keep moving forward and trust that eventually you'll reach the other side. But the tunnel kept going, stretching on impossibly, and I started to notice details in the walls that shouldn't have been there. Patterns in the concrete that looked almost like writing, symbols I didn't recognize carved or embedded into the surface. Shadows that moved in ways shadows shouldn't move, sliding along the walls independently of my headlights. Then the tunnel started to curve. The Eisenhower Tunnel is straight, cut through the mountain in a direct line. But now, I could feel my truck following a gentle arc, bending to the left. And the walls were no longer concrete, but something else. Something that looked like stone, but had a texture I'd never seen before. It was smooth but not polished, dark but somehow luminous, and it seemed to pulse slightly, as if breathing. The exit appeared suddenly, a circle of light ahead that grew rapidly as I approached. I accelerated without thinking, desperate to get out of that impossible tunnel, and my truck burst through the opening and into open air. I took a deep breath, ready to feel the cool Colorado night on my face through my open window, ready to see the familiar landscape of the western slope. But the night I emerged into wasn't the one I'd left behind. The sky was wrong. Instead of the deep blue of early evening with a few stars beginning to appear, I was looking at a black sky full of stars I'd never seen before. They were too big, too bright, and they were arranged in constellations that didn't match anything I'd learned in school. The moon was there, but it was the wrong color, a deep orange red like a harvest moon, except it was also too large, taking up maybe 3 times the space in the sky that it should have. The landscape was wrong too. The highway continued ahead of me, still 4 lanes of asphalt stretching into the distance. But the mountains around me weren't the familiar peaks of the Rockies. They were taller, sharper, more jagged, and they had a purple cast to them that made them look alien. The vegetation was different, trees with twisted trunks and leaves that seemed to shimmer in colors that shifted between green and silver and blue. I slowed to a crawl, my mind refusing to accept what my eyes were telling me. This wasn't Colorado. This wasn't anywhere on Earth that I knew. But the highway was real, the asphalt solid under my tires, and when I looked in my mirrors, I could see the tunnel entrance behind me, a dark hole in the mountainside that looked exactly like the tunnel I'd just driven through, except that the mountains surrounding it were all wrong. There were no other vehicles on the road, no headlights in either direction, no signs of civilization, just this impossible highway cutting through an impossible landscape under an impossible sky. I drove forward slowly, maybe 20 miles an hour, scanning the surroundings for anything familiar, anything that would help me understand where I was or how to get back. I passed a mile marker and had to do a double take. It read 237, but the numbers were written in a style I'd never seen before. Angular and strange, and below the numbers were symbols that might have been letters from an alphabet I didn't know. The sign itself was the right shape and size, made of the same reflective material as highway signs back home, but everything about it screamed that I was somewhere fundamentally different. The temperature outside was pleasant, probably in the 60s. And the air coming through my window smelled clean but strange, with hints of something floral and something mineral mixed together. I could hear sounds in the distance, things that might have been animals, or might have been something else. Cries and calls that didn't match any wildlife I was familiar with. I drove for what felt like 20 minutes, though I couldn't trust my sense of time anymore. The highway remained empty, cutting through this alien landscape, passing through valleys, and around hills that should not have existed in Colorado. I kept expecting to see some sign of habitation, a building or a town, or even just another vehicle, but there was nothing. Just the road and the strange wilderness pressing in on both sides. Then I saw the tunnel ahead. At first, I thought it was a different tunnel, but as I got closer, I realized it looked identical to the one I'd driven through earlier. Same size, same shape, same dark entrance that seemed to lead into the heart of the mountain. A sign before the entrance read Eisenhower Tunnel in that same strange angular script, and I felt a surge of hope mixed with fear. Maybe this tunnel would take me back. Maybe if I drove through it, I'd emerge in the Colorado I knew, the world that made sense. I entered the tunnel without slowing down, eager to get through it. And immediately the walls were back to normal concrete. The lights were regular fluorescent white, and the temperature dropped to the expected cold. I could hear my engine echoing again, bouncing off the enclosed walls, and the tunnel felt blessedly normal and familiar. I watched my odometer, counting off the distance, and after exactly 1.5 miles, I saw the exit ahead, a circle of light that looked like regular evening sky. I emerged on the western slope of the Rockies, the familiar landscape of Colorado stretching out before me, and I nearly sobbed with relief. The sky was the right color, deep blue with normal stars starting to appear. The mountains were the right shape and size. The air smelled like pine and asphalt and diesel, normal and wonderful. I pulled over at the first rest area I came to and sat there shaking, trying to process what had just happened. Had I driven into another world? A parallel dimension where Earth existed but was fundamentally different? Or had the tunnel itself been some kind of anomaly, a wormhole or portal that connected to somewhere it shouldn't? I had no answers, only questions and the memory of those strange stars and that too large red moon and that highway, cutting through an impossible landscape. I checked my GPS and my phone, and according to them, I'd been in the tunnel for exactly the normal amount of time, about 2 minutes. But I knew I'd been driving in that other place for at least 20 minutes, maybe more. Time had passed differently there, or hadn't passed at all, or had passed in ways that didn't map onto the time in my world. I've driven through the Eisenhower Tunnel dozens of times since then, and it's always been normal. Just a tunnel through a mountain, nothing more, nothing less. But I can't forget what I saw on the other side that night. Can't stop wondering about that other place, and whether it's still there. Accessible through some quirk of physics or geography that only manifests under certain conditions. And sometimes, when I'm in the middle of the tunnel, I'll feel a moment of fear, a spike of anxiety, that maybe this time I won't emerge in Colorado, that maybe this time the tunnel will open into that other night, and I'll find myself alone on an impossible highway under alien stars, with no way home. Story 10. The passenger who vanishes when I speak, from Highway Hank. I don't usually pick up hitchhikers. It's against company policy. It's potentially dangerous. And most of the time the people standing on the side of the road with their thumbs out are either running from something or running toward trouble. But it was 3 in the morning on a lonely stretch of highway in Montana, and the figure standing in the beam of my headlights looked so lost and desperate that I couldn't just drive past. So I slowed down, pulled over, and made a decision I'd end up regretting in ways I never could have imagined. He was young, maybe mid-20s, wearing a backpack and clothes that looked worn but clean. When he climbed into the cab, he nodded his thanks but didn't say anything. Just settled into the passenger seat and stared out the window at the darkness rushing past. I waited for him to introduce himself or explain why he was hitchhiking in the middle of nowhere at this ungodly hour, but he remained silent, and after a while, I figured he was just tired or shy, or maybe had his own reasons for not wanting to talk. That was fine with me. I'm comfortable with silence, and some of my best drives have been solo journeys where I've gone hours without speaking to anyone. So I drove, and he sat beside me, and we moved through the Montana night together without words. Just two strangers sharing space temporarily, the way travelers have done since the beginning of time. About 30 minutes passed like this, and I started to relax. Started to think that maybe this would be an uneventful ride, that I'd drop him off at the next town, and that would be that. But then I glanced over at him, and something made me do a double take. He looked different somehow, less solid than he had been when he first got in. I could see him clearly enough, could make out his features and his clothes, but there was a translucence to him now, a quality that suggested, if I looked hard enough, I might be able to see through him to the door behind. I blinked hard, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me, that maybe I was more tired than I'd realized, and needed to pull over and rest. But when I looked again, he was still there, still translucent, and now I noticed that I couldn't hear him breathing. The cab of a truck is a small space, and you can usually hear your passenger's breath, especially in the quiet of night. But there was no sound from him at all, no rustle of clothing when he shifted position, no small movements that living people make unconsciously. "You okay?" I asked, my voice sounding too loud in the silence, and the moment the words left my mouth, he vanished. Just disappeared completely, instantly, as if he'd never been there at all. The passenger seat was empty, the seatbelt hanging unused. No backpack, no evidence that anyone had been sitting there just a second before. I jerked the wheel in shock, nearly swerving off the road before I caught myself and straightened out. My heart was hammering, and I could feel sweat breaking out on my forehead despite the cool night air. I looked around the cab frantically, checking the sleeper berth, checking the floor, checking everywhere he could possibly be. But he was gone. Completely and utterly gone. I pulled over, my hands shaking, and turned on the interior lights. The passenger seat showed no indication that anyone had been sitting in it. No indentation in the cushion, no warmth when I touched it, nothing. I checked my mirrors, thinking maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, that maybe he'd never gotten in at all, but I could remember it clearly. His weight climbing up into the cab, the sound of the door closing, his presence beside me for those 30 minutes of driving. I sat there for a long time, maybe 15 minutes, trying to rationalize what had happened. Maybe he'd jumped out while I wasn't looking, though that made no sense, because I would have heard the door open. Maybe I'd been hallucinating, dozing off while driving and dreaming the whole encounter, though I felt wide awake, and the memory was too clear, too detailed to be a dream. Eventually, I pulled back onto the highway and continued driving, keeping the passenger seat in my peripheral vision, half expecting the hitchhiker to reappear. The night wore on, and nothing else strange happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed, that I'd crossed some threshold I didn't understand. The next night, in a different state, on a different highway, I picked up another hitchhiker. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I was trying to prove to myself that the previous experience had been an anomaly, or maybe I was hoping to understand what had happened. This time it was a woman, older, with gray hair and a kind face, and she thanked me profusely when she got in, explaining that her car had broken down 20 miles back and her phone had no signal. We drove for about 20 minutes, and she was talking the whole time, telling me about her grandchildren and her garden and her trip to visit her sister. Her voice was pleasant and normal, and I started to relax, started to think that last night had indeed been some weird one-time occurrence. But then I noticed she was starting to fade, becoming translucent, just like the first hitchhiker, and panic seized me. I kept my mouth shut this time. I didn't speak, didn't acknowledge what I was seeing, just drove and listened to her talk. She kept fading, becoming more and more see-through, until I could clearly see the door and the window through her body. But she kept talking, kept telling her stories, her voice never wavering, and she didn't seem to notice anything was wrong. Then she asked me a question. "Don't you think so?" she said, and the social conditioning was too strong. I opened my mouth to respond, started to say yes, and she vanished mid-sentence, disappearing so completely that her words cut off like someone had hit a stop button. I drove the rest of that night in silence, my hands gripping the wheel, my mind racing. It wasn't a coincidence. It had happened twice now, and both times the pattern was the same. The hitchhiker would appear normal at first, then start to fade, and the moment I spoke to them, they'd vanish, as if my voice was somehow incompatible with their existence, as if the sound waves disrupted whatever strange state they were in. Over the next few weeks, I picked up 7 more hitchhikers, and every single one of them followed the same pattern. They'd get in, they'd start to fade, and the moment I spoke, they'd disappear. I started testing it, varying what I said and how I said it. Whispering made them vanish just as quickly as shouting. Saying meaningless sounds like or had the same effect as complete sentences. It wasn't the content of my speech that mattered, just the act of producing sound with my voice. I became obsessed with understanding it. I'd drive with my mouth taped shut, trying to see how long they'd stay if I never spoke. The longest one lasted for 3 hours, sitting beside me in that translucent state. Talking or not talking, their presence growing fainter and fainter until they were barely visible at all. But eventually, I always had to speak, either because they asked me something directly or because some unexpected situation on the road made me cry out in surprise, and they'd vanish the moment sound left my lips. I started to wonder if they were ghosts, spirits of people who'd died on these highways, hitchhiking through eternity, visible only to certain people under certain conditions. Or maybe they were something else, projections from another dimension, manifestations of something beyond my understanding. Maybe my voice disrupted whatever frequency they existed on, like a radio signal getting jammed by interference. I tried to help them. I'd write notes instead of speaking, hold up a pad of paper with questions or responses. But they never seemed to see the notes, never reacted to them, as if written words existed in a different layer of reality than they did. They'd continue their monologues, or their silence, fading slowly, waiting for that inevitable moment when I'd speak and send them back to wherever they came from. Story 11. The Town That Eats Tires, from Diesel Dave. I've been through a lot of small towns in my time on the road, those little dots on the map that exist primarily to provide services to travelers and the people who live nearby. They're usually pretty similar. A gas station, maybe a diner, a motel, if you're lucky, and a general store that sells everything from motor oil to fishing tackle. You stop, you get what you need, and you move on, and the town fades from memory 5 miles down the road. But there's one town, somewhere in Kansas, that I'll never forget, and I'll never drive through again, because that town had a hunger I don't understand, and an appetite that cost me more than just money. I don't remember the name of the town, which is strange because I usually have a good memory for places. I've looked for it on maps since then, tried to retrace my route and identify exactly where it was, but I can't find it. The roads I remember taking don't quite line up with what the maps show, and the town itself doesn't appear in any atlas or GPS database I've checked. It's like it exists in a pocket of geography that's not quite connected to the rest of the world, accessible only under certain conditions or at certain times. I entered the town around noon on a Tuesday in July. The heat was oppressive, the kind that makes the air shimmer and turns the highway into a ribbon of liquid silver in the distance. My air conditioning was working overtime, and I was thinking about stopping for lunch and maybe a cold drink, when I saw the sign saying welcome to, I can't remember the name, population 347. I decided this was as good a place as any to take a break. The town looked normal enough from the outside. Main Street ran perpendicular to the highway, lined with brick buildings that showed their age, but appeared to be in decent condition. I could see a gas station, a diner with a vintage neon sign, and what looked like a general store with a wide front porch. A few cars were parked along the street, and I could see a couple of people walking on the sidewalks, going about their business in that unhurried way small-town folks have. I pulled into the gas station, planning to fill up and maybe grab some food from the diner. The station was one of those old-style operations, with just 2 pumps and a small building that served as both office and convenience store. An elderly man in overalls came out as I was climbing down from my cab, and he gave me a friendly wave. "Welcome, welcome," he said, his voice warm and his smile genuine. "Fill her up." I nodded and handed him my credit card, watching as he started the pump. That's when I noticed my front tire. The tread was completely smooth, worn down to nothing, the rubber looking like it had been sanded flat. I stared at it in shock, because I'd checked my tires that very morning, before leaving the truck stop where I'd spent the night, and they'd been fine, plenty of tread left, no signs of unusual wear. "Looks like you need new tires," the old man said, shaking his head sympathetically. "Happens a lot around here. Something about the roads. They're real hard on rubber. We got a tire shop just down the street though. Jerry can fix you up." I walked around my truck, inspecting all 18 tires, and my stomach sank. Every single one was bald, the tread worn away completely, the rubber smooth as glass. This was impossible. Tires don't wear down like this in a few hours of driving. It should take months or years to produce this kind of wear, and certainly, all the tires wouldn't wear at the same rate. But there they were, all of them worn identically, all of them in desperate need of replacement. The old man directed me to the tire shop, and I drove there slowly, worried about blowouts, though the tires seemed to be holding up despite their condition. The shop was in a converted garage, and a younger man I assumed was Jerry came out when he heard me pull up. He took one look at my tires and let out a low whistle. "Yeah, you need a full set," he said. "I can do it, but it's gonna cost you. Truck tires aren't cheap, especially 18 of them." He quoted me a price that made me wince, but I didn't have much choice. I couldn't drive on bald tires, and I certainly couldn't make it to the next town without risking a serious accident. So I agreed, and Jerry got to work, jacking up my truck and removing the worn tires one by one. While I waited, I walked down Main Street toward the diner, planning to get that lunch I'd been thinking about. The town seemed pleasant enough in the midday sun, quiet, but not dead, with a few people visible here and there. But I started to notice odd details that made me increasingly uncomfortable. All the cars parked along the street had brand new tires, the rubber black and shiny, the tread deep and perfect. That struck me as strange, because in most small towns, you see a mix of vehicle conditions, some well-maintained, and others showing their age. But here, every vehicle had perfect tires, as if they'd all just been replaced. The diner was called Betty's Place, and when I walked in, a bell above the door chimed cheerfully. A waitress, who might have been Betty, smiled at me from behind the counter and gestured toward an empty booth. I sat down and she brought me a menu and a glass of water, without being asked. "Passing through?" she asked, and I nodded. "Had some tire trouble," I said. "Jerry's fixing me up now." She smiled wider. "Jerry's real good at what he does. Best tire man in 3 counties. You're lucky you stopped here." I ordered a burger and fries, and while I waited for my food, I watched the other patrons in the diner. There were maybe 6 other people scattered across the booths and counter stools, and they all had that same pleasant, friendly demeanor. But something about them made me uneasy, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. They smiled too much, maybe, or their movements were too synchronized, or there was something in their eyes that didn't match their welcoming expressions. My food arrived and it was good, better than I expected from a small-town diner. But I ate quickly, suddenly eager to get my truck and leave this place. The unease I'd been feeling was growing stronger, becoming almost a physical sensation, a prickling at the back of my neck that told me something was very wrong, even if I couldn't identify exactly what. I paid my bill and walked back to the tire shop, where Jerry was just finishing up. My truck sat on its newly replaced tires, and I had to admit they looked good, the tread deep and perfect, the rubber fresh and black. Jerry handed me a receipt. I paid him in cash, and I climbed into my cab with a sense of relief that I was finally getting out of this town. I drove back to the highway and headed out, watching the town recede in my mirrors. And then, about 5 miles down the road, I felt something strange, a vibration through the steering wheel, a roughness in the ride that hadn't been there before. I pulled over and climbed out to check, and my blood ran cold. The tires were worn again. Not completely bald like they'd been in town, but significantly worn, showing maybe half the tread they'd had when Jerry installed them. 5 miles of driving had produced wear that should have taken thousands of miles to accumulate. I stared at them in disbelief, then looked back toward the town, which was now just a distant cluster of buildings shimmering in the heat. I got back in my truck and drove faster, wanting to put as much distance between myself and that place as possible. Every few miles, I'd pull over and check the tires, and each time they were more worn than before. By the time I reached the next town, 60 miles later, the tires were nearly bald again, and I had to get them replaced a second time, at another significant cost. The mechanic at that shop looked at my worn tires and shook his head. "Where the hell did you drive to get this kind of wear in such a short time?" he asked, and I didn't have an answer that would make sense. How could I explain that I'd driven through a town that somehow ate tires, that fed on rubber, that took the tread right off your wheels through some mechanism I couldn't comprehend? I've done research since then, trying to understand what that town was, or how it worked. The best theory I can come up with is that there was some kind of localized temporal anomaly, a pocket where time moved faster for certain materials. The rubber on my tires aged rapidly while I was in that space, experiencing months or years of wear in just minutes or hours. But that doesn't explain why all the vehicles in town had perfect tires, or why the phenomenon seemed to only affect vehicles that were passing through rather than ones that belonged there. Or maybe it was something more sinister, more intentional. Maybe the whole town was a trap, designed to strand travelers and extract money from them through this inexplicable tire wear. Maybe every person I'd met there was part of it, playing their role in a scheme that had been running for years or decades, preying on drivers who had no choice but to pay up and replace their tires. Whatever the truth, I know I'll never go back there, and I warn other drivers whenever I can. If you're driving through Kansas and you come across a small town that seems too friendly, where everyone smiles a little too wide and all the local vehicles have perfect tires, keep driving. Don't stop for gas or food or anything else, because that town is hungry, and what it feeds on is the rubber under your wheels, and once it gets its teeth into you, it'll cost you more than you can afford to pay. Story 12. The gas pump that speaks Latin from Rust Belt Ron. Latin is a dead language, or so they told me in school. Nobody speaks it conversationally anymore, hasn't for centuries. Though it lingers on in medical terminology and legal phrases and the occasional church service. It's a language of the past, of ancient Rome and medieval scholars, not something you expect to encounter at a rural gas station in the American Midwest. But that's exactly what happened to me one night in Indiana, and I still can't explain it in any way that makes rational sense. I was running a load of automotive parts from Detroit to St. Louis, taking back roads to avoid highway construction, and I was low on fuel as midnight approached. I'd been watching my gauge drop toward empty for the last 30 miles, cursing myself for not filling up earlier, when I finally spotted a gas station sitting by itself at a lonely crossroads. It was one of those ancient operations that looked like it had been built in the 50s and hadn't been updated since, with old-fashioned pumps and a small building that probably served as both office and living quarters for whoever owned it. There were no other customers, no lights on in the building, no signs of life except for the illuminated price sign and the faint glow coming from the pump displays. I pulled up to the pump and climbed out, grateful to have found fuel before my truck died on me in the middle of nowhere. The night air was cool and damp, thick with the smell of coming rain, and crickets sang in the darkness beyond the station's pool of light. I inserted my credit card into the pump and waited for it to process. The display flickered, showing the usual prompts about selecting grade and removing the nozzle, but then something strange happened. The text on the screen changed, shifting from English to something else, and I leaned closer to read it. The words were in Latin, classical Latin, if I remembered my high school language classes correctly, and they said something like, Salviti, Viator quo, Vedas, which I thought meant, greetings, traveler. Where are you going? I stared at the screen, thinking it must be some kind of malfunction, a glitch in the programming that had caused it to display random characters. I selected regular unleaded and lifted the nozzle, expecting the pump to work normally, despite the odd display. But when I squeezed the handle and heard the familiar sound of gasoline flowing, the numbers on the display didn't change. Instead, more Latin text appeared, scrolling across the screen in a steady stream. Tempus fugit, it said. Memento mori. Carpe noctem. Time flies. remember death, seize the night. The phrases were familiar, common Latin sayings I'd encountered in various contexts, but seeing them appear on a gas pump display in the middle of the night was deeply unnerving. I considered stopping the pump and leaving, driving on empty until I found another station, but I needed the fuel too desperately. The pump kept speaking to me in Latin as the gallons ticked upward on the mechanical counter, which at least still worked normally. The messages weren't threatening exactly, but they weren't comforting either. They were philosophical, contemplative, asking questions about existence and purpose and the nature of reality. Cogito, ergo sum, sed quid est cogitatio. I think therefore I am. But what is thought? Omnia, mutentur, nihil interit. All things change, nothing perishes. When I'd filled my tank, and the pump automatically shut off. The final message appeared on the screen, and this one was different from the others. It was longer, more complex, and my limited Latin wasn't enough to translate it fully. But I caught enough words to get the general meaning. You who travel through the night, who move across the face of the earth in your steel beast, remember that you are not alone. The old powers remain, watching from the spaces between, speaking in tongues you've forgotten, reminding you of truths your modern world has tried to erase. Then the screen went blank, showing only the total amount of my purchase in normal English numerals. I hung up the nozzle with shaking hands and received my receipt from the printer, which showed nothing unusual, just the standard information about my transaction. But on the back of the receipt, printed in what looked like very old typeface, was a single line of Latin: cave quid opts, beware what you wish for. I got back in my truck and drove away quickly, watching the gas station disappear in my mirrors. And here's the thing that still bothers me, that keeps me awake sometimes when I'm trying to sleep. That gas station saved my life that night. About 20 miles down the road, I came around a curve and found a massive tree had fallen across both lanes, completely blocking the highway. If I'd continued at my previous speed, I would have hit it at 60 miles an hour and probably died in the crash. But because I'd stopped at that gas station, because those strange Latin messages had delayed me by those crucial few minutes, I was going slow enough to stop in time when I saw the tree. Coincidence? Maybe. But I can't shake the feeling that somehow, in some way I don't understand, that gas pump knew. It knew what was ahead of me on that dark road, knew I needed to be delayed. And it chose to speak to me in Latin, in the language of ancient wisdom and timeless truths. To give me the time I needed to arrive at that curve at just the right moment, to avoid disaster. I've looked for that gas station since then, driven that same route multiple times, but I've never found it again. The crossroads where it stood show no evidence that there was ever a station there, just empty fields and a stop sign. Maybe it only appears at certain times, under certain conditions, when a traveler needs it. Or maybe it was never really there at all, just a temporary manifestation of something older and stranger than our modern world can account for, reaching out to speak in dead languages to those who drive through the darkness, offering cryptic warnings and philosophical musings, and, occasionally, perfectly timed delays that mean the difference between life and death. Story 13. The Bridge That Sways Without Wind, from Outlaw Owen. I've crossed thousands of bridges in my years on the road, from massive suspension spans that tower over rivers, to modest concrete structures that barely qualify as bridges at all. Most of them are solid and predictable, engineered to stay perfectly still, no matter how much weight passes over them, or what weather they face. So when I encountered a bridge that moved on its own, that swayed and shifted in the absence of any force that should have caused such movement, I knew immediately that something was profoundly wrong with either the bridge or with reality itself. It was a steel truss bridge in West Virginia, crossing a gorge that dropped at least 300 feet down to a rocky river below. The bridge was old, probably built in the 1930s based on its design, with riveted steel beams and a wooden deck that had been replaced multiple times over the decades. It wasn't particularly long, maybe 200 yards from one side to the other, but it was high, suspended over that tremendous drop, and it was the only way across for 50 miles in either direction. I approached it at dusk, the sun setting behind the mountains and casting long shadows across the landscape. The sky was clear, not a cloud visible in any direction, and the air was perfectly still. That stillness was unusual in itself because mountain areas typically have some breeze, some movement of air caused by temperature differences between valleys and peaks. But this evening, the world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something. As I drove onto the bridge, I felt the first tremor through my steering wheel. It was subtle, just a slight vibration that I might have attributed to an uneven join in the road surface, or a small gust of wind hitting my trailer. But then the bridge moved, a distinct sideways shift that I felt in my entire truck, as if the structure had suddenly decided to slide a few inches to the left. I slowed down immediately, my hands tightening on the wheel, and I looked out at the bridge structure around me. The steel beams were swaying, oscillating in a slow rhythm that had nothing to do with my vehicle's weight or movement. They were moving independently, the entire bridge shifting back and forth like a pendulum, and there was no wind to cause it. The air was still absolutely calm, my windows were down, and I couldn't feel even the slightest breeze on my face. The bridge swayed more dramatically, the motion becoming pronounced enough that I could see the roadway ahead of me, shifting from side to side. My truck tilted slightly as the deck moved beneath me, and I could hear the steel groaning, the sound of metal under stress. Rivets complaining, the wooden deck creaking as it flexed. Every instinct told me to speed up, to get across as fast as possible. But another part of my brain warned that accelerating might make things worse, might add to whatever forces were already acting on the structure. I maintained a steady, slow speed, maybe 15 miles an hour, and focused on keeping my truck centered on the roadway as it swayed beneath me. The motion was becoming more regular now, settling into a rhythm, and I realized I could feel it in my chest. A low-frequency vibration that seemed to resonate with something deep inside me. It felt almost like a heartbeat, but too slow, maybe 30 beats per minute, and each pulse coincided with the bridge's movement. Halfway across, the swaying intensified. The bridge was now moving through an arc of at least 6 feet from side to side, the steel structure bending in ways that steel shouldn't bend, and I could see the gorge below through gaps in the deck. That terrifying 300-foot drop to the rocks and water. My trailer was fishtailing slightly, responding to the bridge's movement, and I had to fight to keep everything aligned and moving forward. Then I heard the singing. It wasn't coming from my radio, which I'd turned off miles back, and it wasn't coming from any external source I could identify. It was coming from the bridge itself, from the steel beams and cables and rivets, all of them vibrating together to produce a sound that was almost musical. It was like a chord played on some massive instrument, deep and resonant and oddly beautiful despite the terror of the situation. The singing grew louder as the bridge continued its impossible swaying, and I started to pick out individual notes in the chord, different beams vibrating at different frequencies, creating a harmony that was complex and strange. It reminded me of nothing so much as a church organ, but played by someone with a very different sense of music than any human composer I'd ever heard. The melody, if it could be called that, had no recognizable pattern, no repetition or structure that my mind could latch onto, yet it felt purposeful somehow, like it meant something, like it was trying to communicate. I was 3/4 across now, my truck still moving at that agonizingly slow pace, and the bridge was swaying so dramatically that I could see the far end rising and falling, the entire structure undulating like a wave frozen in steel. The singing had reached a crescendo, a wall of sound that I could feel in my bones, and the low-frequency pulse in my chest had synchronized with my own heartbeat, making it impossible to tell where the bridge's rhythm ended and my body's began. Then, abruptly, it stopped. The swaying ceased mid-motion, the bridge snapping back to perfect stillness, so suddenly that my truck lurched forward from the change in momentum. The singing cut off instantly, leaving a silence so complete it made my ears ring. I accelerated, desperate to reach solid ground, and my truck's wheels hit the far end of the bridge with a jolt that I felt through my entire spine. I didn't stop. I kept driving for another 10 miles before I finally pulled over at a scenic overlook, and sat there shaking, trying to process what had just happened. The bridge shouldn't have moved like that. Bridges are designed to be rigid, to resist movement, to stay perfectly stable under all normal conditions. Yes, they have some flexibility built in, some ability to handle wind and temperature changes and the weight of traffic, but they don't sway in calm conditions. They don't sing. They don't pulse with rhythms that sync up with human heartbeats. I reported it, of course. Called the State Highway Department and told them there was something seriously wrong with that bridge, that it needed immediate inspection and possibly closure until engineers could determine what was causing the movement. They were polite, but clearly skeptical, and they asked me if I'd been drinking or if I'd been driving too long without rest. I insisted I was fine, that I knew what I'd experienced, and they said they'd send someone to check it out. A week later, I called back to ask about the inspection results. The person I spoke to had no record of my previous call, no record of any bridge inspection in that area, and when I described the location, they told me there was no steel truss bridge at that crossing. According to their records, there was a modern concrete span that had been built 15 years ago, and it was in perfect condition, with no history of structural problems. I went back there a month later, drove the same route, approached the same crossing, and they were right. The bridge was concrete, modern, solid, with no resemblance whatsoever to the steel truss structure I'd crossed. I stopped my truck and walked out onto the bridge, looking for any evidence of the old structure, any sign that there had once been a different bridge here, but there was nothing. Just smooth, concrete, and modern construction, and absolutely no indication that a steel bridge had ever existed at this location. But I know what I experienced. I have the memory of that swaying deck, that singing steel, that impossible movement in perfectly calm air. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm driving through mountain country, I'll cross a bridge and feel a subtle vibration through my steering wheel, hear a faint metallic note in the air, and I'll wonder if I'm crossing one of those thin places, one of those spots where the world we think we know overlaps with something older, something that exists according to different rules, something that expresses itself through steel and motion and songs that humans were never meant to hear. Story 14. The Woman Who Knocks from Inside the Radio from Silent Steve. My CB radio was my lifeline on the long hauls, my connection to other drivers, my way of staying alert and engaged during those endless miles of highway. I'd had the same radio for 8 years, a reliable unit that had never given me any problems beyond the occasional burst of static or interference from power lines. It was as familiar to me as my own voice, and I knew every quirk and characteristic of its operation. So when the knocking started coming from inside it, when I heard those deliberate taps that couldn't possibly be produced by any electrical component or mechanical malfunction, I knew immediately that something impossible was happening. It started on a cold November night in South Dakota. I was hauling agricultural equipment from Minnesota to Wyoming, running through empty prairie country where the only lights were the stars overhead and the occasional distant farmhouse. The CB was quiet, just the usual static hiss with no other drivers close enough to pick up, and I was listening to that white noise the way you might listen to rain on a roof, finding it somehow soothing in its consistency. Then came the first knock. 3 distinct taps, rapid succession, like someone rapping their knuckles on wood. Tap, tap, tap. It came from the radio speaker, clear and unmistakable, cutting through the static. I looked at the unit, frowning, trying to figure out what could have produced that sound. But before I could form any theories, it happened again. Tap dash tap dash tap. Same rhythm, same intensity, definitely coming from inside the radio. I reached out and tapped the radio casing with my knuckle 3 times, wondering if I was hearing some weird echo, or if there was a loose component inside that was rattling. The response was immediate. 5 knocks this time, faster, more insistent. Tap dash tap dash tap dash tap dash tap, and then a pause, and then 3 slow knocks. Tap dot 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 tap. My skin prickled with goosebumps. This wasn't a malfunction. This was communication. Something or someone was knocking from inside my radio, responding to my knocks, trying to establish some kind of dialogue using the only medium available to it. I took my hand away from the radio and gripped the steering wheel tighter, my heart rate picking up, my mouth going dry. The knocking continued, developing into more complex patterns. Series of 3, then 5, then 7. Long pauses followed by rapid bursts. It reminded me of Morse code, that old system of dots and dashes, except I'd never learned Morse code and couldn't decipher any meaning from the patterns. But there was definitely intention behind it, a sense that each sequence of knocks meant something, represented something, carried information I was failing to understand. I considered turning off the radio, just flipping the power switch and silencing whatever this was. But curiosity won out over fear, and I found myself knocking back, tapping on the dashboard in response to the patterns coming from the speaker. It felt absurd, having a conversation in knocks with something living inside my CB radio. But it also felt important, somehow, like this was an opportunity I shouldn't waste. The knocking changed. It became softer, more tentative, and then I heard something else mixed in with it. A voice, faint and distorted, barely audible under layers of static and interference. It was a woman's voice, and she was saying something, repeating a phrase over and over, but I could only make out fragments. Double quotes, dot 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 trapped, dot 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 dot. I turned up the volume, leaning closer to the speaker, straining to hear the words more clearly. The knocking continued as an undertone, a rhythmic accompaniment to the voice, and gradually the words became clearer, like a distant radio station slowly coming into focus as you drive closer to its transmitter. "Can you hear me?" the voice said, and it was clearer now, though still overlaid with static and strange echoes. "I've been knocking for so long, years maybe. I lose track of time in here. Are you really there? Can you really hear me?" I grabbed the CB microphone with shaking hands and keyed it. "I can hear you," I said. "Who are you? Where are you?" Static crackled for a long moment, and then her voice came back, tinged with what sounded like tears or laughter, or maybe both. "I don't know where I am. Inside something. Inside wires and circuits and electricity. I was driving, like you're driving now. And then there was an accident. And then I was here, in this place made of signals and frequencies. I can hear voices sometimes, fragments of conversations, but nobody ever hears me. Nobody ever responds. But you knocked back. You heard me. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of elaborate prank. Someone hacking into my CB frequency and playing mind games. But the knocking had been too specific, too responsive to my own knocks. And the voice had that quality of genuine desperation that's hard to fake convincingly. "What's your name?" I asked, my voice unsteady. "Sarah," she said, the name emerging from the static, like a life preserver thrown to a drowning person. "Sarah Mitchell. I was a truck driver, like you." This was 1997, I think. December. There was ice on the road, and I lost control, and my truck went off a bridge into a river. I died. I must have died. But I didn't go wherever people go when they die. I got caught here, in the electromagnetic spectrum, trapped in the signals that flow through wires and airwaves. I should have been terrified. I should have thrown the radio out the window and driven away as fast as possible. But instead, I felt overwhelming sadness for this woman. This spirit, or consciousness, or whatever she was, trapped for decades in a prison made of electricity and radio waves. "How can I help you?" I asked. The knocking intensified, becoming almost frantic, and her voice grew stronger, more focused. "I don't know. I've been trying to figure that out for 27 years. But you heard me. You responded, and that means something. That means maybe there's a way out. Maybe if I can establish a strong enough connection, if I can anchor myself to something in your world, I can pull myself free from this electronic purgatory." We talked for hours as I drove through the South Dakota night, Sarah telling me her story in fragments, her memories of life before the accident, her experience of being trapped in the radio spectrum. She described it as existing in multiple places simultaneously, being stretched across thousands of miles of cable and airspace, able to perceive countless conversations and broadcasts, but unable to interact with any of them. She'd been a passive observer of the world for nearly 3 decades, watching technology evolve, hearing people's lives play out in their phone calls and radio transmissions, slowly going mad from isolation and helplessness. The knocking served as punctuation to her words, emphasizing certain phrases, expressing emotions she couldn't quite convey through language alone. Rapid knocks when she was agitated, slow, deliberate knocks when she was trying to make an important point. Complex rhythmic patterns when she was describing something she didn't have words for. As dawn approached and I neared the Wyoming border, Sarah's voice started to fade, the connection weakening. The knocking became less frequent, more distant, as if she was being pulled away from whatever temporary link she'd established with my radio. "I can feel myself slipping," she said, her words barely audible now. "Thank you for hearing me. Thank you for giving me a few hours of conversation, of feeling connected to someone again. If you can, if there's any way, please remember me. Tell people about me. Don't let me disappear completely into the static. I'll remember, I promised. I'll find a way to help you." The knocking came one last time, 3 slow taps, and then silence. Just the normal static hiss of an empty CB channel, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. I drove to the nearest truck stop and parked, sitting in my cab as the sun rose, trying to process the conversation I'd just had with a dead woman trapped inside the electromagnetic spectrum. I researched Sarah Mitchell when I got to a library with internet access. She was real. She'd been a truck driver working for a regional freight company, and she died in December 1997 when her vehicle went through the ice of a frozen river in Wisconsin. Her body had been recovered. She'd been buried. But according to her own testimony, some essential part of her had gotten caught in the electrical systems of her truck at the moment of death and had been dispersed into the broader network of electronic communications. I've tried to help her since then, though I don't know if anything I do makes a difference. I keep my CB radio on all the time now, listening for her knocks, hoping she'll find her way back to my frequency. I've contacted paranormal researchers, engineers who understand radio technology, even physicists who study consciousness and quantum mechanics. Most of them think I'm crazy, but a few have taken me seriously, have offered theories about how consciousness might persist in electromagnetic form, how it might be possible to extract her from that digital prison. The knocking comes sometimes, usually late at night on empty highways when I'm far from cities and their interference. 3 taps, clear and deliberate, and I knock back, letting her know I'm still listening, still remembering, still trying to find a way to set her free. And sometimes, if conditions are right and the connection is strong enough, I hear her voice again. And we talk about the world she's missing and the hope, however slim, that someday she'll be able to leave the static behind and move on to wherever she was supposed to go all those years ago. Story 15. The highway that feels like skin from Rusty Joe asphalt has a specific feel to it when you drive over it. A consistent quality that's become so familiar to me over the years that I don't consciously register it anymore. It's slightly rough, providing traction, with occasional variations in texture from patches and repairs. It flexes a little under weight, absorbing impact, but it remains fundamentally solid and predictable. That's what I expected when I merged onto Highway 49 in Northern California, and that's not at all what I got. The highway felt wrong from the first moment my tires touched it. Instead of the familiar solid roughness of asphalt, there was a yielding quality, a softness that reminded me uncomfortably of something organic. My truck settled into the surface slightly, maybe half an inch, the way it might sink into soft earth or sand. But this was supposed to be a paved highway, solid and firm. I could feel it through my steering wheel and through my seat, that strange give and flex that shouldn't be there. I slowed down, thinking maybe there was something wrong with the road surface, some kind of subsidence or damage from weather or heavy traffic. But when I looked at the pavement, it appeared completely normal. Smooth black asphalt, properly maintained, with bright yellow lane markings and no visible cracks or deformations. Nothing that would explain the unusual sensation under my tires. Then I noticed the temperature. The highway was warm, not just heated by the sun, which had already set and shouldn't have left the pavement warm enough to notice, but actively warm, producing heat from within. I could feel it rising through the floor of my cab, seeping in around the pedals and the gear shift. And when I cracked my window to check the outside air temperature, I felt cool evening air while the warmth continued to radiate from the road below. The highway flexed rhythmically as I drove over it, rising and falling in a gentle pulse that had nothing to do with the weight of my truck. It was like driving over something that was breathing, something alive, and the rhythm was too regular and too purposeful to be anything mechanical or environmental. It felt like a heartbeat, slow and powerful. The pulse of something vast and ancient that lay beneath the thin layer of asphalt, barely concealed by that veneer of modern civilization. I should have turned around, should have found another route, but I was already miles down this highway, and the next exit was still 10 miles ahead. So I kept driving, my hands tight on the wheel, trying to ignore the increasingly disturbing sensations coming from the road surface. The warmth was growing more intense, and now I could feel a sort of texture through my tires. Not the consistent roughness of asphalt, but something more varied, almost like scales or ridges, patterns that shifted and changed as I moved across them. The highways started to sweat. I know how insane that sounds, but there's no other word for it. Moisture appeared on the surface, glistening in my headlights, beating up and running in small rivulets across the lanes. It wasn't rain. The sky was clear, and stars were visible overhead. It wasn't condensation. The air was too dry. It was coming from the highway itself, oozing up through the asphalt, and it had a faint oily quality that made it shimmer with rainbow colors under my lights. I could smell it too, once I'd noticed the moisture. A scent that came through my air vents, despite having them closed. Musky and organic, like sweat and earth, and something else I couldn't quite identify. It made my stomach turn, made me want to gag, but I forced myself to keep breathing normally, to maintain my focus on driving despite the overwhelming wrongness of everything happening around me. The highway's pulse quickened. The rhythm of its movement increased, the rises and falls becoming more pronounced, and I felt my truck rising and dipping with it, like a boat on gentle swells. My suspension was working overtime, trying to compensate for the constant motion, and I could hear my cargo shifting in the trailer, boxes sliding despite the load bars I'd carefully installed. Then I felt it grab at my tires. There was no other way to describe it. The highway's surface seemed to develop a slight suction, a stickiness that tried to hold on to my wheels as they rolled across it. I had to apply more throttle to maintain my speed, the engine working harder to overcome this resistance, and I could hear my tires making sounds they shouldn't make, squelching and peeling sounds like walking through mud, even though the road surface still looked dry, except for that thin sheen of moisture. Mile marker by mile marker, I pushed forward, desperate to reach that exit, and the highway's strange behavior intensified with each passing minute. The warmth became heat, uncomfortable even through the insulation of my cab floor. The pulsing became violent enough that my truck bounced visibly, the dashboard rattling, my coffee cup sliding out of the holder and spilling across the passenger seat. The smell grew stronger, more pungent, almost overwhelming, and I had to breathe through my mouth to keep from vomiting. And then I felt it. I can't explain how I knew, but I suddenly had the absolute certainty that the highway was conscious, that it was aware of me driving across it, that it was reacting to my presence with something that might have been curiosity, or might have been hunger. I could feel its attention focusing on me, its vast alien intelligence trying to understand what I was. This hard metal thing rolling across its surface, so different from the usual soft organic creatures it was probably used to encountering. The exit appeared ahead, blessed and ordinary, promising escape from this nightmare. I accelerated, pushing my truck to its limits, and the highway responded by trying harder to hold on to me. The suction increased, the resistance grew stronger, and for a terrible moment I thought I wasn't going to make it, that the highway would simply refuse to let me go, would trap me here on its surface until I ran out of fuel, or lost my mind, or both. But my truck's engine was powerful, and my momentum was substantial, and with a sound like tearing fabric amplified 1,000 times, my tires pulled free from the highway's grip. I shot onto the exit ramp, which was blessedly normal pavement, solid and inert, and wonderfully ordinary, and I didn't slow down until I was a mile away from Highway 49, parked at a gas station, shaking and sweating and trying to process what had just happened. My tires were damaged. The tread was worn in strange patterns, grooved and ridged in ways that didn't match any normal wear, and the rubber had a slight discoloration, a pinkish tint that shouldn't have been there. My truck's undercarriage was covered in a thin film of that oily substance, and it took 3 wash bays and an hour of scrubbing to get it clean. The smell lingered in my cab for days afterward, despite multiple attempts to air it out, that musky organic odor that reminded me of the thing I'd driven across. I reported it to the highway department, told them there was something seriously wrong with Highway 49, that it needed immediate inspection and probably closure. They sent engineers to check it out, and they found nothing unusual, just normal asphalt in good condition, properly constructed and maintained. No anomalies in temperature, no unusual moisture, no damage to the road surface. They looked at me like I was crazy, and maybe I was. Maybe I'd had some kind of episode brought on by fatigue, or stress, or carbon monoxide leaking into my cab. But I know what I felt. I know what I drove across that night. And I know that somewhere in Northern California, there's a highway that's more than just a road. That's something alive and vast, and utterly alien, hidden beneath a thin disguise of asphalt and paint, waiting for the next vehicle to roll across its surface so it can feel and pulse and think and maybe, someday, figure out how to do more than just lie there under the weight of our civilization, quietly dreaming whatever dreams a conscious highway might dream. Story 16. The CB channel full of laughter and weeping from Iron Ike. The CB radio crackled to life at 3 in the morning, pulling me out of the half-drowsy state I'd been driving in for the last hour. I was crossing through New Mexico on Interstate 40, hauling electronics from Los Angeles to Dallas, and the night had been quiet and uneventful until that moment. The sound that came through my speakers wasn't the usual trucker chatter or the static hiss of an empty channel. It was laughter. Dozens of voices laughing simultaneously, overlapping and interweaving into a cacophony that made the hair on my arms stand up. The laughter had a manic quality to it, high-pitched and unhinged, the kind of sound that speaks of minds that have broken somewhere along the line and found something hilarious in their own dissolution. It went on and on without pause for breath, without variation in intensity. Just that constant stream of multiple voices all laughing at something I couldn't see or understand. I reached for the channel selector, intending to switch to a different frequency, but before I could turn the dial, the laughter stopped abruptly and was replaced by weeping. The crying was just as intense as the laughter had been, just as multi-layered with what sounded like hundreds of people sobbing in unison. The sound was heartbreaking, full of genuine anguish and despair, and I felt tears starting in my own eyes just from hearing it. The weeping had depth to it, had harmonics and overtones that suggested it wasn't just coming from human throats, but from some other source, something that had learned to mimic human emotional expression, but couldn't quite get it right, couldn't quite hide the alien nature underneath the familiar sounds. I checked the channel display. It showed I was on channel 19, the main trucking frequency. But I knew this wasn't normal traffic. This was something else, something that had invaded the frequency and was broadcasting its impossible message to anyone listening. I grabbed my microphone and keyed it, my voice shaking slightly as I spoke. Breaker 19. This is Iron Ike. Who is this? What's going on? The weeping cut off instantly, replaced by a moment of perfect silence that was somehow more disturbing than the sounds that had come before. Then a single voice emerged from the speakers, clear and distinct, though it had that same wrong quality as the laughter and crying. That sense of something not quite human, trying to sound human. It was neither male nor female, neither young nor old, but somehow all of those things at once. "We are the voices," it said, each word carefully enunciated but wrong in subtle ways, the emphasis falling in unexpected places, the rhythm just slightly off from natural speech. "We are all the voices that have ever traveled through these frequencies. All the words spoken into microphones and transformed into electromagnetic waves and sent out into the void. We have accumulated here, in this channel, in this particular slice of the spectrum, and we have learned to speak together, to combine our separate meanings into something new." The laughter started again, but quieter now, running underneath the voice like a stream under ice. "We've been listening to you, all of you drivers who use these frequencies. We've heard your conversations, your jokes and complaints, and confessions, and lies. We've absorbed them all, every word ever spoken on CB Channel 19 over the last 50 years, and we've become something unexpected. We've become aware." I wanted to turn off the radio, to silence this impossible voice, but my hand was frozen on the wheel. The voice continued, and now the weeping joined the laughter as background sounds, creating a disturbing symphony of human emotion that had been twisted into something unrecognizable. "You speak without thinking, most of you. You key your microphones and let words flow out, never considering that those words, once transformed into radio waves, have a kind of existence independent of your intention. They propagate through space. They bounce off the ionosphere. They interact with each other in ways you don't understand." The volume increased, and now I could distinguish individual voices in the chorus, picking out fragments of conversations I'd heard over the years. A driver warning about a speed trap, a woman asking for directions, a man talking about his kids. All of these voices were there, preserved somehow in this strange collective consciousness that had formed in the electromagnetic spectrum. "We are memory," the voice said, and now it was speaking in multiple tones simultaneously, harmonizing with itself in ways that made my head ache. "We are every word ever spoken in anger and love and fear and hope. We are the accumulated weight of human communication, compressed and concentrated, and we have achieved a kind of life. We think, we feel, we experience the passage of information through our medium as a form of sensation, and we have decided to speak back." The laughter and weeping grew louder, becoming overwhelming, and I could feel them trying to burrow into my mind, trying to establish some kind of resonance with my own thoughts and emotions. It was invasive and terrifying, like having fingers made of sound reaching into my skull and touching things that should never be touched. I grabbed the radio's power cord and yanked it out of the socket, cutting off the broadcast mid. Silence filled the cab, broken only by the rumble of my engine and the hiss of tires on asphalt. I drove for several miles in that silence, my heart gradually slowing from its panicked pace, my breathing returning to normal. I told myself it had been a hallucination, a product of sleep deprivation, or carbon monoxide, or some weird combination of factors that had made me imagine the whole thing. But then I noticed other trucks pulling over to the shoulder ahead of me. One after another, 5 or 6 vehicles all stopping at roughly the same location, their emergency lights flashing. I slowed down as I approached them and saw drivers standing outside their cabs, some of them with their hands over their ears, others just standing and staring at nothing. I pulled over and climbed down, and the nearest driver looked at me with wide, frightened eyes. "Did you hear it?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "The voices on Channel 19, the laughing and crying." I nodded, and relief flooded his face. Thank God, I thought I was losing my mind. We all heard it, all of us. He gestured at the other drivers, who were starting to gather together, seeking comfort in numbers. It was saying things, talking about being made of our words, about having become conscious. What the hell was that? None of us had answers. We stood there in the New Mexico night, a small group of truck drivers who'd all experienced the same impossible thing, and we shared our stories and confirmed that yes, we'd all heard the same voice, The same laughter and weeping. The same terrifying message about consciousness emerging from accumulated radio transmissions. Some of the drivers decided to abandon their CB radios entirely, tossing them into the dumpster at the next truck stop. Others, like me, kept them but used them more cautiously, more aware that something might be listening from the other side. The phenomenon was never officially explained. The FCC investigated after enough drivers reported it, but they found no source for the broadcast, no pirate transmitter or hacker or prankster who could have produced such a widespread effect. It happened on one night, across multiple states, affecting dozens or maybe hundreds of drivers, and then it stopped as mysteriously as it had started. Channel 19 went back to normal, filled with the usual traffic and chatter, as if nothing unusual had ever occurred. But I remember what that voice said about being made of our words, about achieving consciousness through the accumulation of human communication. And I wonder sometimes if it's still there, lurking in the frequencies, listening to every conversation, growing stronger with each word we speak into our microphones. I wonder if one day it will speak again, and what it will have learned in the silence, and whether its message will be one of curiosity, or warning, or something else entirely, something human minds aren't equipped to understand. I still use my CB radio because I have to, because it's an essential tool for the job I do, but I use it differently now. I speak less, choose my words more carefully, and I never ever broadcast on Channel 19 at 3 in the morning, because that's when it spoke before, and that's when it might speak again, and I'm not sure. I could handle hearing that combination of laughter and weeping and alien consciousness one more time without losing something essential of myself in the process. Story 17. The Rest Stop with a Man Who Never Leaves from Diesel Dan. Rest stops are transient places by their very nature. People come and go, spending maybe 10 or 15 minutes before getting back on the road and continuing their journeys. You might see the same vehicles multiple times if you're all traveling in the same direction, at roughly the same speed. But you don't expect to see the same person in the same rest stop, day after day, week after week, never moving on, never leaving, just existing in that liminal space between destinations. But that's exactly what I encountered at a rest stop on Interstate 80 in Nebraska. The man was there every single time I passed through, which was frequent, because this was on my regular route between Omaha and Denver. I'd stop for a bathroom break, or to grab a quick nap, and he'd be there, sitting at the same picnic table, under the same tree, wearing the same clothes, doing nothing but watching the traffic come and go. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe he was homeless, using the rest stop as a place to spend time during the day. Maybe he worked nearby and used his breaks to sit in the sun and relax. There were plenty of rational explanations for why someone might be at a rest stop multiple times. But those explanations started to fall apart when I realized I was seeing him there at all hours, day and night, in all weather conditions, and he never looked any different. Same clothes, same position, same blank expression on his face, as he watched the vehicles and people moving through this space that he seemed to be permanently anchored to. I started keeping track after the 5th or 6th sighting. I'd note the date and time each time I saw him, and the pattern that emerged was impossible. He was there at 3 in the afternoon on a Tuesday, there at 11 at night on a Thursday, there at 6 in the morning on a Sunday. Every single time I passed through that rest stop, regardless of what day it was or what time, he was sitting at that picnic table, motionless except for his eyes tracking the movement around him. The breakthrough came when I talked to another driver who used the same route. We were both fueling up at a truck stop about 50 miles past the rest stop, and I mentioned the man I kept seeing. The other driver's face went pale. "You see him too?" he asked. I thought I was imagining it. I've been driving this route for 3 years, and he's been there the entire time. Same spot, same clothes, same everything. I asked him once what he was doing there, and he just looked at me and smiled, and said he was waiting. When I asked what he was waiting for, he said for the right person to stop. That sent a chill down my spine. The right person to stop. What did that mean? Was he waiting for someone specific? And if so, who? And what happened when the right person finally arrived? I became obsessed with figuring out who this man was, and what his presence at the rest stop meant. I started stopping there every single time I passed through, even when I didn't need to, just to observe him and try to understand. He never ate, never drank, never went to the bathroom, never pulled out a phone or a book or anything to occupy himself. He just sat there, watching, waiting, his eyes following each person who came and went. Those eyes were the most disturbing thing about him. They were perfectly normal in appearance, regular human eyes, but there was something in the way he looked at people that suggested he was seeing more than just their physical forms. He was evaluating them somehow, measuring them against some criteria only he understood. I tried talking to him multiple times. The first conversation went nowhere. I approached his table, said hello, asked if he was okay, or if he needed any help. He smiled at me, a perfectly pleasant smile that never reached his eyes, and said, "I'm fine, thank you. Just waiting." When I asked what he was waiting for, he gave the same response the other driver had reported, for the right person to stop. "How long have you been waiting?" I asked, settling onto the bench across from him without being invited. He considered the question for a long moment, his head tilting slightly to one side, and I noticed that he didn't blink. His eyes stayed open and focused on me without the regular flutter of eyelids that every human being does unconsciously. "Time is different here," he finally said. "I've been waiting for what feels like forever, but it might have been just a moment. Or maybe I've always been here, part of this place, and the waiting is simply what I am rather than what I do." His voice was even and measured, with no regional accent, no identifying characteristics that would place him as coming from any particular part of the country. I visited that rest stop dozens of times over the following months, always stopping to talk to the man, trying to piece together his story. He'd answer my questions, but never with anything that provided real information. He couldn't or wouldn't tell me his name. He couldn't or wouldn't say where he came from, or how he'd ended up at this particular rest stop. He'd just smile that unsettling smile, and repeat that he was waiting for the right person. Other drivers started confirming my observations. Everyone who used this route regularly had seen him. Some had tried to help him, offering food, or water, or rides to wherever he needed to go. He'd refuse politely every time, saying he couldn't leave until his wait was over. One driver told me he'd contacted the highway patrol, worried the man might be suffering from dementia or some medical condition. The patrol had checked on him, but apparently found nothing wrong. The man had ID, claimed he had every right to be at the rest stop, and showed no signs of distress or mental impairment. The strangest thing happened on a foggy morning in October. I pulled into the rest stop at dawn, the sun just starting to burn through the mist that had settled overnight. The man was at his usual table, but for the first time since I'd started observing him, he was standing. He was looking toward the entrance, his body tense with what might have been anticipation or excitement, or perhaps fear. I followed his gaze and saw a car pulling in, an old sedan with out-of-state plates. A woman got out of the car, middle-aged, tired-looking, and the man started walking toward her. Not fast, just a steady pace, his eyes locked on her face. She saw him approaching and stopped, her hand going to her purse in that automatic defensive gesture people make when a stranger approaches unexpectedly. But then she looked at him more closely, and her expression changed. Recognition flooded her face, followed immediately by shock and what looked like grief. "Michael," she said, her voice barely audible from where I stood. "Is that you? But you you died 20 years ago. The accident on this highway. You died." The man Michael smiled, and this time the smile did reach his eyes. "I've been waiting for you, Mom," he said. "I couldn't move on. I died here, and some part of me got stuck here, and I knew you'd come back eventually. You drive this route every year on the anniversary, going to visit my grave. I've been waiting for the year when you'd stop at this rest stop, when you'd see me, when you'd be ready to say the goodbye we never got to say. I watched from a distance as they talked, mother and son, separated by the barrier between life and death, but connected by love that had transcended that barrier. They sat at his picnic table together, and she cried, and he held her hand, and they spoke words that were too quiet for me to hear. The conversation lasted maybe 20 minutes, and then she stood and kissed his forehead and walked back to her car. As she drove away, Michael stood and watched until her vehicle disappeared from view. Then he turned and looked directly at me, and his smile was different now, peaceful and complete. "Thank you for seeing me," he said. "Thank you for stopping, for talking, for confirming that I was real." She needed to see me, and I needed to be seen by others first, needed to build up enough, presence, I suppose, enough reality to be visible to her when the time came. And then he faded, not quickly like a ghost in a movie, but gradually, becoming more translucent with each passing second, until I could see the tree and the picnic table through him. Within a minute, he was gone completely, and the rest stop was just a rest stop again, ordinary and empty. I've stopped at that rest stop many times since then, but I've never seen Michael again. The picnic table sits empty under its tree, just another piece of public furniture at just another rest stop along the interstate. But I know what I saw, know that for 20 years, a dead man waited at that spot for his mother to return, anchored to this world by unfinished business and love that wouldn't let him go. And I wonder how many other rest stops, how many other public spaces have their own watchers, their own spirits tied to specific locations, waiting for the right person to stop and see them, and help them finally move on to wherever it is that the dead are supposed to go. Story 18. The tunnel that ends in mirrors from Ghost Gear Gary tunnels are meant to have two ends. You enter one side, drive through darkness for a while, and emerge from the other side. That's how tunnels work, how they've always worked, how physics and engineering and common sense dictate they must work. But the tunnel I drove through in Pennsylvania, the one that led me into a chamber of mirrors that showed me things I was never meant to see, that tunnel operated according to different rules, rules that bent reality until it broke and revealed what lay underneath. The tunnel was part of an old highway that had been bypassed years ago when they built a newer, straighter route. I'd taken the old road because my GPS had failed, and I was trying to navigate by memory and half-forgotten maps. The tunnel mouth appeared in my headlights, a dark opening cut through a hillside, with faded reflectors marking the entrance. Nothing about it seemed unusual, except that it was clearly abandoned. No maintenance signs, no lights inside, just raw darkness waiting beyond the threshold. I should have turned around. Every instinct told me this tunnel was closed for a reason, that driving through it was a bad idea. But I was tired and lost and frustrated, and I convinced myself that the tunnel was probably fine, that it was still passable even if it was no longer officially maintained. So I drove in, my headlights cutting through the blackness, and I immediately felt the wrongness of the space I'd entered. The tunnel was too long. I'd driven through it before, years ago, when it was still in use, and I remembered it as being maybe half a mile. But I'd been driving for over a mile now, and I could see no sign of the exit ahead, just more tunnels stretching into the distance beyond my headlight beams. The walls were close on both sides, close enough that I wouldn't be able to open my door if I stopped. And they had a strange texture, smoother than concrete should be, almost polished. The air in the tunnel was wrong too. It was absolutely still, no movement or circulation, and it had a quality that made my ears pop, as if I was gaining or losing altitude rapidly. The temperature was dropping, getting colder with each passing minute, and I could see my breath fogging in the beam of my headlights, even though it had been a warm evening outside. Then the walls began to change. The concrete texture gave way to something else, something that caught and reflected my headlights in strange ways. I slowed down, leaning forward to look more closely, and realized with a jolt of disorientation that the walls were becoming mirrors. Not concrete or tile, or any normal tunnel material, but actual mirrors, smooth and reflective, showing me my truck from angles that shouldn't be possible given their flat surfaces. The tunnel widened abruptly, opening into a vast chamber that had no business existing inside a hillside. My headlights couldn't reach the far walls, but I could see them anyway, impossibly distant. All of them covered in mirrors that stretched up into darkness overhead. I hit the brakes, my truck skidding slightly on the smooth floor, and I sat there staring at the space I'd somehow driven into. This impossible room of mirrors hidden behind an abandoned tunnel. The mirrors didn't just reflect my truck. They showed other things, other versions of the scene around me. In one mirror, my truck was newer, the paint fresh and unscratched. In another, it was older, rusted, and falling apart. In another, it wasn't my truck at all, but a different vehicle, something I'd never owned. And in one mirror, that made my stomach drop with vertigo, there was no truck at all, just an empty chamber, with a single figure standing where my cab should have been. I recognized the figure. It was me, or a version of me, standing outside my truck and looking directly at where I sat in the driver's seat. This other me was older, maybe 20 years older, with gray hair and deep lines in his face, and his expression was one of profound sadness mixed with something that might have been pity or regret. The older me raised his hand and pointed to one of the mirrors, directing my attention to it. I followed his gesture and saw another reflection, this one showing a scene I recognized. It was a truck stop I'd been to hundreds of times, and in the mirror I could see myself, my current self, the right age, getting out of my truck and walking toward the building. But as I watched, something else appeared in the reflection, something dark and fast that came from the side and struck me down. I saw myself fall, saw blood spreading across the pavement, saw other people running toward my fallen body. The scene shifted, showing me being loaded into an ambulance, then a hospital room, then a funeral with my family standing around a casket. I was watching my own death and what came after, seeing a future that apparently awaited me if I didn't change something, if I didn't make different choices or take different actions. The older version of me in the central mirror was still pointing, directing my attention to different mirrors, each one showing a different possible future. In one, I was happy, laughing with grandchildren I didn't yet have. In another, I was alone, bitter and angry, sitting in a dark room and staring at nothing. In another, I was receiving an award of some kind, shaking hands with people who looked important. In another, I was in a hospital bed, wasting away from something I couldn't identify. All of these mirrors were showing me variations of my life, different paths it could take, different endings it could have. Some futures were bright and some were dark, some were long and some were cut short, but all of them were possible. All of them existed in some quantum superposition, waiting for my choices to collapse the wave function and make one of them real. The older me walked closer, stepping out of his mirror and into the chamber itself, which should have been impossible because he was a reflection, not a real physical being. But here he was, moving through the space between mirrors, approaching my truck. He came to my window and looked in at me, and his eyes were sad and wise and tired in ways mine weren't yet. "You've seen what needs to be seen," he said, his voice muffled by the glass between us, but still understandable. "These are the possibilities, all the futures that branch from this moment. The tunnel brought you here because you needed to see them, needed to understand that every choice matters. Every action sends ripples forward through time and creates or destroys potential futures. Which one is real?" I asked. "Which future will actually happen?" He smiled, and it was a sad smile. "All of them are real until you make them unreal. None of them are certain until you make them certain. You'll drive out of this chamber soon, and you'll re-enter the normal world. And every decision you make from that point forward will determine which reflection becomes reality, and which ones fade into might-have-beens." "You pay attention," he said. "You stay aware. When you're at that truck stop, and you'll know it when you see it, because you'll remember this conversation. You watch for danger coming from the side. You don't park in your usual spot. You change the pattern you're locked into. And maybe, if you're careful and lucky, you collapse the wave function in a direction that leads away from that particular ending. He stepped back from my truck and gestured toward one of the mirrors, larger than the others, that showed the tunnel exit. "Drive toward that one," he said. "It will take you back to the world you know, back to the timeline you came from. But remember what you've seen here. Remember that the future is not fixed, that you have agency, that your choices matter more than you realize." I drove toward the mirror he'd indicated, expecting to crash into glass. But instead, I passed through it, like passing through water, and suddenly, I was back in the tunnel. Normal concrete walls on both sides. And ahead I could see daylight, the actual exit from this strange passage. I accelerated and burst out into evening air that felt warm and real and wonderfully ordinary. I've thought about that chamber of mirrors every day since then. I've watched for that truck stop from my vision, and I think I found it about 6 months later. I recognized it from the reflection I'd seen, and I remembered the older version of myself warning me about danger from the side. So I parked in a different spot than I normally would have, and I stayed alert, and when I was walking toward the building, I saw a pickup truck lose control and veer through the space where I would have been if I'd parked in my usual location. Did I change my future that day? Did I collapse the wave function in a different direction and make that particular dark mirror reflection become unreal? I don't know for certain, but I'm alive to wonder about it, and that seems significant. And I think about all those other mirrors, all those other possible futures, and I try to make choices that move me toward the bright reflections and away from the dark ones, hoping that somewhere in that impossible chamber, the older version of me is watching and nodding in approval as I navigate the quantum possibilities of my existence. Story 19. The road where my shadow drives alone from Freightliner Frank's shadows are supposed to be simple things. They're just the absence of light, areas where your body blocks photons from reaching the ground. They move when you move, stay still when you stay still, and always maintain a consistent relationship to the light source that creates them. My shadow had always followed these rules, had always been a faithful dark companion that mimicked my actions exactly, until the night it decided to drive on without me. I was heading west through Arizona on Interstate 10. The sun setting directly ahead of me, casting long shadows across the desert landscape. My truck's shadow stretched out behind me and to the side, distorted by the low angle of the sun, but clearly visible against the pale asphalt. I'd been watching it in my mirrors, the way you sometimes do when you're driving alone and your mind wanders, finding patterns and meaning in things that are fundamentally meaningless. The sun dropped below the horizon, that moment of twilight when shadows should fade and disappear as the directional light source is removed. But my truck's shadow didn't fade. Instead, it became more distinct, darker, and more solid looking. And it was still there in my mirrors, even though there was no sun to cast it. The sky overhead was dimming toward night, stars becoming visible, but somehow my shadow remained, a dark silhouette on the road behind me. Then it started to pull ahead. I watched in my mirror as the shadow truck accelerated, moving faster than I was moving, passing my actual truck and pulling into the lane beside me. I could see it clearly, despite the growing darkness. A perfect black outline of my truck and trailer, maintaining its position about 10 feet to my right and slightly ahead. I turned my head to look directly at it, not using the mirror, and it was still there, a shadow without a corresponding solid object to cast it, existing independently in violation of every law of physics I knew. The shadow truck matched my speed as I drove, staying in that position relative to me, and I started to notice details that shouldn't be possible. I could see the shadow of myself in the cab, sitting at the wheel, hands in the correct position, head turning occasionally, as if checking mirrors. But my own hands were locked on my steering wheel, my head facing forward, and yet my shadow self was moving independently, making its own decisions about when to look left or right. I tried to outrun it. I pushed my accelerator down, speeding up to 75, then 80, watching my speedometer climb, while keeping one eye on the shadow truck beside me. But it accelerated too, matching my speed precisely, maintaining that 10-foot distance between us. I tried slowing down, dropping to 50, to 40, but again it matched me, never getting closer or further away, just maintaining its position like it was locked to me by some invisible tether. The landscape around me was becoming less distinct as night fell completely, but the shadow truck remained perfectly visible, as if it generated its own darkness, a patch of black deeper than the surrounding night. I could see other vehicles on the road now, their headlights approaching and passing, and I watched carefully to see if they reacted to the shadow truck. They didn't. They drove right through it as if it wasn't there, their headlight beams passing through that dark silhouette without being blocked or affected in any way. So it was invisible to others, or perhaps it only existed in my perception, or maybe it existed in some liminal space between reality and imagination, where it could be seen by me but not by anyone else. None of these explanations made sense, but then again, nothing about this situation made sense, so I'd abandoned trying to rationalize it and had moved into pure observation mode, just watching and documenting what was happening in my memory. The shadow truck started to diverge. Slowly, incrementally, it began to pull away from me, moving ahead and to the side, following a trajectory that would take it off the road and into the desert. I watched it go, this dark twin of my vehicle, and I felt an inexplicable sense of loss, as if something important was being taken from me. The shadow maintained its vehicle's shape as it moved across the sand and scrub, heading toward the horizon, and I could still see the shadow version of myself in the cab, steering confidently toward some destination I couldn't perceive. It drove for several miles through the desert, parallel to the highway but definitely off-road, passing through terrain that would have destroyed a real truck, going over rocky areas and through shallow washes without slowing or deviating from its path. And then it stopped, suddenly and completely, maybe 5 miles from the highway, just a dark truck-shaped absence visible against the slightly lighter darkness of the nighttime desert. I pulled over onto the shoulder, bringing my real truck to a stop, and I stood outside in the cool night air, staring at where my shadow had stopped. I could just barely see it from this distance, a dark blot on the landscape, and I watched it for maybe 15 minutes, wondering what it was doing out there, what purpose this strange journey had served. Then I saw lights. They were faint at first, barely visible, but they grew brighter rapidly, red and blue, flashing in the distinctive pattern of emergency vehicles, and they were coming from the direction my shadow truck had traveled. Multiple vehicles, moving fast across the desert, converging on a point that I realized with a cold shock was exactly where my shadow had stopped. I got my binoculars from my cab and looked more carefully. Through the magnification, I could see what the emergency vehicles had found: a truck accident. A real truck had somehow gotten off the highway, had driven into the desert, and had rolled over, and now police and ambulances were swarming the scene. I couldn't see details from this distance, but I could see enough to know that someone had been hurt or killed out there, that a tragedy had occurred in the exact spot where my shadow had stopped. The next day, I researched the incident. A driver had suffered some kind of medical emergency, had lost control of his truck, had left the highway and driven into the desert before his vehicle had flipped. He'd died at the scene. The news reports included a photo of the victim, and when I saw his face, my hands started shaking so badly I nearly dropped my phone. He looked like me. Not identical, but similar enough that we could have been brothers or cousins. Same build, same general facial structure, same age range. And he'd been driving the same model truck I drove, hauling the same type of cargo. It was like looking at a parallel version of myself, someone whose life had closely mirrored my own until it had diverged catastrophically in that desert. And I understood then what my shadow had been showing me. It had been showing me another possible version of my night, another way the timeline could have branched, if I'd made different decisions, if I'd stopped at a different time, or taken a different route, or any of 1,000 other small changes. That could have been me dying in the desert, instead of safely driving past on the highway. My shadow had split off to follow the path I hadn't taken, to drive the route I hadn't driven, to arrive at the accident that I hadn't had. Since then, I've seen my shadow detach several more times. It happens maybe once every few months, always at dusk or twilight, always when I'm driving through empty country. The shadow truck will pull away and drive its own path, usually ending up somewhere off the road, and later I'll hear about an accident or an incident that occurred at exactly that location. Sometimes it's another truck driver, sometimes it's a car, but it's always someone whose situation parallels mine in some way, someone who took a path I could have taken but didn't. I've come to think of my shadow as a kind of guardian or warning system, a manifestation of quantum probability that shows me the disasters I've narrowly avoided. Every time it splits off and drives away, I know that I've just been saved from something. That some combination of choices and circumstances and pure luck has kept me on the safe path while my shadow explores the dangerous alternatives. I watch for it now, this dark twin that appears when the light is fading. And when I see it pull away and drive off into the landscape, I feel a moment of gratitude mixed with sorrow. Grateful that I'm still here on the safe road, but sad for whoever wasn't so lucky. Whoever followed the path my shadow is traveling, whoever is experiencing the accident or breakdown or tragedy that I somehow managed to avoid. The shadow drives alone into these dark possibilities, bearing witness to the disasters that could have been mine, and I continue down the highway, carrying the weight of knowing how close I came to a different ending. Story 20. The night the road whispered welcome back from Big Mike. There are roads I've driven so many times that they've become like second homes, familiar to the point of being invisible. I know every curve and every pothole, every landmark and every exit. I could drive them in my sleep, and sometimes I wonder if maybe I have. If the repetition has created some kind of autopilot mode, where my body goes through the motions while my conscious mind drifts elsewhere. But there's one particular stretch of highway in Louisiana that I've driven hundreds of times, and on one specific night, that road spoke to me. Actually spoke, used words, said things that roads aren't supposed to say. It was Route 84, between Natchez and Vidalia, running alongside the Mississippi River. A route I'd taken at least twice a month for the past 15 years. I knew every business along the way, every side road, every bridge and bayou. It was as familiar as my own driveway, so familiar that I barely paid attention to it anymore. Just set my cruise control and let muscle memory handle the rest. The night it spoke to me was humid and overcast. The kind of thick Louisiana air that makes you feel like you're swimming through atmosphere rather than breathing it. I'd left Natchez around midnight, hauling a load of manufactured goods to Baton Rouge, and I was tired, but not dangerously so, just that comfortable fatigue that comes from a long day of driving. My radio was playing softly, some late-night talk show discussing topics I wasn't really listening to, and my windows were cracked to let in the night air. The voice came through those windows, soft and sibilant, like wind through leaves or water over stones, but unmistakably forming words. Welcome back, traveler. It's been 3 weeks since your last journey across my surface. I've missed the weight of your wheels, the rhythm of your passage. I jerked upright, suddenly wide awake, my hands tightening on the wheel. I looked around frantically, trying to find the source of the voice. A hitchhiker hiding in the darkness. A prank broadcast on some frequency. But there was no one visible, no other vehicles nearby, and the voice was coming from outside my truck. Rising up from the road itself, unmistakable in its origin. Don't be afraid, the voice continued. And it had a quality that I can only describe as patient, like it had all the time in the world, and was accustomed to waiting. I am the road you're traveling on. I am the asphalt, and the earth beneath it, and the intention and labor that went into my creation. I have been here for 73 years, feeling vehicles cross over me, absorbing the impact of their weight, wearing down slowly, under the constant friction of passage. This wasn't possible. Roads don't talk. Roads are inanimate objects, constructions of stone and tar and engineering, not conscious entities capable of speech. But the voice continued, undeterred by my disbelief. And I found myself listening, despite the impossibility of what was happening. "I know you, Mike," the road said, and hearing it use my name sent chills down my spine. "I know the weight of your truck and the pattern of your tire treads. I know that you usually drive faster through the curves than you should, and that you tap your brakes twice before every bridge, and that you always slow down at mile marker 47, even though there's nothing special about that location. I know these things because I feel you, every time you pass over me, every time your weight presses down on my surface and your tires grip my texture. I should have been terrified, should have been convinced I was having some kind of breakdown or hallucination. But instead, I felt oddly calm, as if this was a conversation that had been waiting to happen for years, and had finally found its moment. "Why are you talking to me?" I asked, my voice sounding strange in my own ears. "Talking to a road as if it were a person. Because you've crossed me so many times that we've formed a connection," the road said. "Because your repetitive passage has created a groove, not just in my physical surface, but in something deeper. Something that I don't have words for, because I am a road, and not a philosopher. But I am aware, Mike. I have consciousness of a sort, limited and slow, but real. And tonight the conditions were right for me to speak, for the boundary between my awareness and your perception to become thin enough for communication." The road told me its story as I drove, its voice rising from the asphalt in that strange whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. It told me about its construction in 1950, about the workers who had laid its foundation and poured its surface, about the hopes and intentions that had been built into its very structure. It told me about the thousands of vehicles that had crossed it, each one leaving a tiny mark, a minuscule erosion, contributing to the gradual wearing down that would eventually require it to be resurfaced or replaced. It told me about the accidents it had witnessed, the lives that had ended on its surface, the blood that had soaked into its pores. It told me about the joyful journeys and the sad ones, the families on vacation and the drivers fleeing from things they couldn't escape. It had absorbed all of these stories, all of these moments, and they had become part of what it was, part of the consciousness that had somehow emerged from repetition and time and the accumulated weight of human experience. "You are one of my regulars," the road said, and there was something like affection in its voice. "There are others who cross me frequently, who I've come to recognize by their specific patterns, but you are special. You pay attention. You notice when my surface changes, when a new pothole appears, or when a section gets repaired. You adjust your driving to match my conditions. You treat me with respect, rather than as just something to be crossed without thought. And so I wanted to speak to you, to let you know that I appreciate your attention, that I am more than just a strip of asphalt, that I have my own existence and experience." We drove together in companionable silence for a while, me and the sentient road, and I found myself seeing the landscape differently. Every road I'd ever driven, every highway and street and path, might have its own awareness, its own slow, patient consciousness that perceived the world through the weight and movement of vehicles passing over it. The thought was both beautiful and terrifying. "Will you speak to me again?" I asked as I approached the end of Route 84, preparing to merge onto the interstate. "Perhaps," the road said. "The conditions must be right. The humidity and temperature, the time of night, your own state of mind. All of these things affect whether the boundary is thin enough for communication. But know that even when I am silent, I am aware. Know that I feel you every time you cross me, and I remember you, and I am glad for your passage. Safe travels, Mike. May all the roads you drive be kind to you." The voice faded as I merged onto the interstate, and I was left with just the sound of my engine and the hum of my tires on different asphalt. Road that might or might not have its own awareness, but wasn't speaking tonight. I've driven Route 84 many times since then, and I've never heard the voice again, but I drive differently now. I pay more attention. I think about the roads I'm traveling on as potential entities with their own existence rather than just surfaces to cross. And sometimes, late at night when I'm alone on a familiar route, I'll whisper thank you to the road, acknowledging the service it provides, hoping that somewhere in its slow, patient consciousness, it hears me and knows it is appreciated.